Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and we are here for my NACL Week 1 overview analysis, and of course, at the end, my updated power rankings. Incredibly excited to make this video, the first NACL video of the year, or at least the first weekly recap. Of course, if you haven't checked out my preseason NACL power and player rankings, you can check that out up in the iCard right now. I go over all 16 teams in the NACL, their roster, what I think of them, what I think their ceiling is, what I think their floor is, etc., etc. If you want a more in-depth breakdown on who these teams are, you can go ahead and check out that video. But one thing that I do want to do in this video that maybe I haven't done for some of the others is get right into the action. We have a ton of games to get into. This is going to be the most amount of games that I cover in any weekly recap for any region, including the LPL and the LEC, who are now at Super Weeks, and so I don't want to waste too much of your time at the beginning here. I'm just going to quickly say, if you are excited for the video, let me know down in the comments section below. What teams were you most excited to see at the start of the year? What teams kind of interested you on paper, and did they live up to those expectations? Of course, let me know all of that down in the comment section below, but again, let's not waste too much time. We have 18 best of 2 series to cover in this video. I'm going to try to go through them in about 3 to 4 minutes each. Of course, some might go over, some might go a little under. There's not a ton to talk about, but I am going to be talking about every single series that happened here in week 1 of the NACL. So we're going to kick it off with our first series of day number 1. And it was a fun one. It was the reigning champions of Academy and of Proving Grounds, Team Liquid Challengers, taking on the Cincinnati Fear. And I was actually really interested to see this. Obviously, TLC made some pretty big changes over the course of the offseason. A lot of their roster gets poached for the LCS. You've got your mid, your ADC, your support, all getting LCS jobs this offseason, and so you've really got to rebuild, but they go in a really nice direction. Obviously, Team Liquid going for the big Korea influence, the TLCK kind of stuff, and that definitely bled over into the Challengers team here with Mir, obviously formerly known as Arthur, coming in, with Arrow and Kim Down coming in to play in the bot lane. A lot of Korean players or Korean descent players coming into play here, but really in game number 1, which was the TLC win, a lot of the win was off the back of APA in the mid lane. Now, I've been really high on APA for quite a few years now, as you guys know, on this channel. I was really excited to see him finally get a shot here in Challengers and Academy in the second tier of North American League of Legends, and he played really well in game number 1. He was probably the biggest reason why TLC was able to pick up that win on the Cassiopeia. I talked about this in my LEC review. I expect to see more Cass as we go throughout the season. I think she actually does a really good job into a lot of the meta mid laners right now, or at least a lot of the mid laners that are super high prio, most notably, of course, Ryze, who I think she actually plays against really solidly. Of course, if you can play the Cassio at a high level, you can do a ridiculous amount of damage towards the late game of these team fights, but TLC kind of ran away with game number 1. But game number 2, on the other hand, was actually taken by Fear, which was super duper impressive. I was really not super high on Fear as a package coming into the year. Obviously, players like Perry and Trevor, I had known a little bit from Academy back in the day, but I really wasn't super high on, Faisal and Shochi in particular, the solo laners on this team. They really hadn't shown me something that was like, oh, I should definitely be looking at them as some of the more interesting players in their roles. However, in game number 2 here, they played fantastic. I got to give a ton of credit to both of them. In my opinion, game number 2 really was Shochi's coming out party. I thought he was fantastic on the Syndra. He would have been my, game 2 player of the game, but gotta give a lot of credit to Faisal in the top lane. Gotta give a lot of credit to Perry in the jungle. I've always liked Perry. I actually think he's been a little bit underrated over the course of the last year or so because people saw the Dignitas move as kind of a downgrade, quote unquote, for Dignitas, going from XU to Perry, at least for Dignitas Academy back last year, but he actually played really well in that Proving Grounds tournament. Definitely filled in admirably for a team that really wanted to contend, and Dignitas Academy was a lot better than people gave them credit for, I think, towards the end of that year. And so that top 3 looked really, really good, and that's really a good sign. I think you're looking at both mid laners saying, well, APA kind of definitely got the better of them in game number 1. Shochi definitely got the better of APA in game number 2. So they kind of balance themselves out for me. My player of the series here in Series 1 is actually going to go to Faisal in the top lane. I think you could say that he wasn't exactly player of the game in either of the first 2 games. However, I think he was the most consistent player over the course of the series. He looked okay on the Olaf in game 1, even in the loss. Bradley did have a bit of pressure, especially in those side lane matchups, but there's really only so much you can do on Olaf when your team is losing, when your team is down, and so he kind of, just lost along with the rest of his team, but he was still relatively positive, I would say, even in game 1. But game number 2 was really good on the Cassante. I thought he showed a lot of really interesting things. Cassante, obviously one of those champions that is incredibly strong right now, but Bradley does go for the counter matchup with the Gwen, maybe something that isn't going to be quite as good outside of laning phase, but something that should be able to neutralize Cassante early, and even then, Bradley really wasn't able to keep up with him, and so Faisal was actually really impressive. Bradley was one of the top laners I was going into the NACL this year with the highest expectations of, and I think Faisal definitely outperformed him in that game number 2, just outplayed him, which is really impressive. So for me, he's actually going to get my player of the series in the first series of the year for the NACL, but on Fear's side, at the very least, big credit to that top 3 just in general. Faisal, Perry, Shochi all played really, really well, and I think all of them deserve a ton of shoutouts. I usually don't like the Vi pick, but Vi into Kindred I think is a little bit more playable. I don't like the Kindred pick much either, and like I always say, you have to be on the better team in order for the Vi pick to really look as good as it needs to be, and I do think Fear was better in game number 2 by a consistent margin, but that's not to say the TLC was bad. They obviously had a really good game number 1 here, APA really carrying the load on the Casio, but unfortunately, I have to give a dud of the series, and my dud of the series here in series number 1 is actually going to go to Bradley in the top lane. I was really hoping to see more from him. He was going up against a top laner that I really didn't have the same kind of expectations for as some of the other, you know, amateur to academy or amateur to challengers top laners that might be coming in this year. A player like Moose Hater, I don't think Faisal was really on that level for me when I was watching his tape, so I thought Bradley should have been able to win this matchup. Also, getting the counter pick in game number 2, like that's supposed to be huge, but he loses that matchup. It's definitely a little disappointing. You're really going to need to see a little bit more out of Bradley in order for TLC to be one of those top challengers teams, because that's really got to be where their expectations are. This is not an org and not a team that is going to want to sit there at around 6 or 5 or 7 or somewhere in that range for most of the year. This is an organization and a team in particular that has consistently been at the top of the standings over the past 2 or 3 years, and so I would be shocked if they weren't moving in that direction for something similar this year, and Bradley is definitely going to need to be one of the players that steps up in order to facilitate them getting to that. But again, positive takeaways. I thought APA was pretty good. I thought Mir had some good games and some bad games. He was really good on the Maokai in game 1, but the Kindred game in game 2, he just got completely run off the map by Perry. But that's kind of what happens if Kindred gets behind. There's really not a lot that that champion can do to salvage the game. And then bot lane, honestly, I haven't really talked about either bot lane here because bot lane was relatively boring. Arrow and Kim down on the Jhin Nautilus both games. Not really a lot of interactivity when it comes to that lane. The Varus is just going to be able to play safe, and Jin's not really going to have a ton of kill pressure early. Both sides were definitely playing more for the top side of the map. And so overall, really, really interesting series. You would have hoped that Team Liquid would have been able to take both games in this series, but taking game number 1, that's okay. Obviously, splitting 1-1 in a best of 2 isn't the worst thing in the world. You definitely don't want to be losing series this early in the year to teams like Fear, but for TLC, I definitely think they can bounce back. And then for Fear, honestly, this is a great start to the year. Losing to TLC isn't the worst thing in the world. They just won Proving Grounds, but being able to take a game off of them in game number 2 in such a dominant fashion, looking good on the top side of the map, it's very, very inspiring for their chances throughout the rest of the year. I think this roster showed a lot of things that I didn't expect them to show early on, and I'm really excited to see where they go from here. Moving on to our second series here of day number 1, we had our first inter-squad matchup of the year here, of course, in the NACL. A little bit of a format change from Academy last year. Not only do we have Academy teams, we also have some provisional amateur teams, and that includes some LCS-sponsored ones, so sometimes we might get some inter-org battles, and that's what we got here, is we saw CLG Challengers taking on CLG Faith. And things definitely go as planned in this series. CLGC is able to pick up both games in the best of 2. They're able to take down CLG Faith, and that should surprise nobody. Not only are they in the same organization and a tier higher, so obviously that's a pretty big advantage, but this is a roster that is returning 4 of the 5 members that they played with last year, and so they're going to have an advantage at the beginning of the year in terms of synergy anyways, and so a lot of advantages going in the way of CLG Challengers, and they're able to capitalize on both of them. Game number 1, really interesting draft, but a lot of focus on the Caitlyn Lux bot lane. Obviously, when you draft that, you're going to want to put a lot of focus in it. CLG Faith does something interesting. They try to counter with Ziggs Jhin, and I actually don't hate this conceptually. I just don't think it was ever going to work when you're not as talented in the bot lane, because when those skirmishes do break out, I actually favor the Caitlyn Lux along with the Sejuani over the Graves coming to the support of the Ziggs and the Jhin. You just don't have nearly enough peel in the early game to stop Lux from being a problem, and so Meech is actually able to just snowball the game out of control and really just get to a point where he's really, really strong. Kevy does a really good job enabling, and really good game by Breezy on the Lux to be able to push forward as well. And then game number 2, was really the two carry roles for CLGC. It was Meech again here on the Varus, being able to do a ton with those Qs, and then Copy actually had a fantastic game here on the Sylas. Now, I was really interested to see how Copy would perform early in the year. Obviously, we know Copy. He is a really solid mid laner at this level. He's been playing for Cloud9 for a couple of years now. He gets a shot here on CLGC with the roster that is really talented. I was interested to see if he was going to take more of a carry role, kind of similar to what Triple had for this team last year, or if he was going to play similarly to how he played for C9C, or C9A last year, I guess I could say, and that being a more supportive mid, a more shove and roam oriented mid. That's what kind of came out here with the Sylas, but that's not a problem at all. Obviously, he's very good at that playstyle, and I think he definitely shows up and does that well. I think those two players on CLGC were the two best players for the team. I think Breezy is also in that conversation, but Copy and Meech were definitely the two players that stood out the most for me. Meech is going to get my player of the series here. I actually really liked him in both Game 1 and Game 2. He does really well on these more resource-intensive AD carries, things like the Caitlyn. Varus, maybe not so much, but the Caitlyn definitely falls into that. I've always said this about Meech. He might just be the single most mechanically talented player in the NACL, in the Academy scene. He just kind of needs to put the whole package together before he becomes one of the best AD carries in the region in that respect. But it feels like every single series that we watch of him, he does get a little bit better. I think him and Breezy are developing a really nice chemistry in lane, and Kevy actually did a really great job of being able to enable that bot lane early on in the series. And then for CLGF, a little bit of a rough series. It's always tough when you have to play a team that's just straight better than you to start your year, because not only are you just trying to get some synergy under your belt, under your feet, like there's just not a huge chance of you being able to win the series, quite frankly, and they weren't able to do that here. I think a couple of players in particular were definitely overmatched. Bajani in the top lane, I was definitely a little frustrated with over the course of the two games, most specifically Game 2. He plays two tanks. Obviously, the scoreline's going to look a little bit worse because you're on the losing side playing Ornn and Gnar, and that's just going to make your score look worse. But at the same time, he was just completely beaten up by Jenkins on a tank and Cassante. You want to see something a little bit more stable on the top side. I was worried about him going into the year. Both of the solo laners, quite frankly, I was worried about going into the year. It was just Bajani that I think didn't really hold up, at least in the first series. I actually thought Serenak was good. He was, relatively speaking, probably the most consistent player on the side of CLGF in this first series. I did like NXI as well. I thought he made some good plays, but the bot lane also kind of got a little bit rolled here. Sketch and Plux, obviously, are going to be playing for CLGF. I'm not sure if that's going to be a full year thing. Obviously, they announced BMFX and Sketch as their bot lane, but whatever is going on with BMFX, he's not playing right now. I don't know if that will last the whole split or if it's just a little bit temporarily, like some of the other, some people are getting visa issue problems and some, et cetera, et cetera. There's a couple roster problems going on in the NACL right now. I'm not sure if that is going to be a similar one or if Sketch and Plux is just going to be the bot lane for CLGF all year long. If it is, I do think that maybe the floor raises a bit. I talked about this a bit in my Power Rankings video. Maybe the floor raises a bit, but maybe the ceiling lowers a bit, in my opinion. BMFX was definitely an interesting player, but I've never seen Sketch play support, and so I don't really know how that's going to go. Sketch and Plux obviously played together last year, but they just weren't on the same level as Meech and Breezy. A lot of pressure in the bot lane, and they just unfortunately weren't able to keep up. But for me, Bajani's a pretty easy choice for dud of the series, even if Sketch and Plux weren't perfect. So overall, the series kind of went exactly as anticipated. No real major surprises. The bot lane looked really, really good for CLGC, though, and that's exactly what you wanted to see out of the first series of the year. Starting our second slate of games here in day one of NACL Week 1 action, we had a matchup between two actual Challengers teams, two teams that are on relatively the same level of playing field. We had Golden Guardians Challengers taking on 100 Thieves Challengers, and while I say same level of playing field, one of these teams should have been better than the other. Unfortunately, they are going to trade 1-for-1. Of course, some roster problems going on the side of 100 Thieves. We'll get into that. That's not going to last the whole week. It was just for this debut game, but no Unforgiven and no Destiny. Obviously, visa issues are a little bit of a problem for a lot of teams in the NACL and in North America just in general right now, especially from OS, so Destiny is not able to get in. I don't know what the problem was with Unforgiven. I don't know if it was visa as well, but I've been hearing obviously mostly OS players getting stuck with those visa problems. So it's actually Viper and Light Pulse coming into play for 100 Thieves here. Viper, obviously former LCS player, former Rookie of the Year, and most notably, brother of Sniper in the top lane. And so that's really, really fun. Sniper making his, second tier of North America debut. And getting to do that alongside his brother is probably fantastic. Light Pulse, not somebody we've really seen at this level, but has been a pretty consistent support over the last few years in the amateur scene. And then on the side of Golden Guardians, they've got their whole roster. It's just, it's Golden Guardians Challengers. I really don't have a ton of upside for this team, and they kind of showed that a bit. Game number 1 was all 100 Thieves, especially Sniper. I mean, it is really hard to talk about the series without first mentioning Sniper. He was phenomenal. All eyes were on him in the top lane. Obviously, he is one of the most, if not the most hyped prospect that North America has ever had, coming out of Amateur and then going into Academy and kind of just waiting for his time in the LCS, waiting for him to get old enough. He looked fantastic in this series. He's going up against one of the weaker top laners in all of the NACL this year, in my opinion. In concept, someone who just wasn't able to hold his own really at all last year in Academy, and looks like that's translating, and Sniper looked it. Like, Sniper dominated the top lane matchup. I know the scoreline doesn't exactly tell you that he dominated, but he looked fantastic in this series. Pretty easy choice for player of the series, in my opinion, but big shout out to Yukino in the jungle. I actually thought he was also really, really solid in this series. 2 games of Vi, and while it was a little bit worse in game number 2, which we'll get to, game number 1 looked really, really solid from him. And then Viper and Lightpulse honestly filled in really, really well. Viper was super aggressive on the Lucian, which I really did want to see out of a player who has always been known for his very good mechanics, maybe not necessarily for his great decision-making in the top lane. And so, I really did like how he played on the Lucian Nami. Kind of an interesting little tidbit there. I expected him to come in and be a little bit more, I don't know, coin flippy, and he actually looked pretty solid this series. But then, game number 2, Golden Guardians is able to take it. They are able to pick up the win here off the back of Young, and Young looked really, really, really good, in my opinion, in this series. I expected him versus Pretty to be very Pretty favored. Pretty is someone who I really like in the mid lane position, but honestly, Young just outplayed him in game number 2 on the Sylas, which is super impressive, and that's the kind of form you really want to see. Obviously, Young played in the LCS a bit over the week as well. We'll get to that, obviously, in the LCS video when we talk about that. Plug for that coming tomorrow. But Young looked really, really good in this series. In my opinion, easily the best player on Golden Guardians Challengers. Even though I actually like how Prismo played, again, only so good you can look on Yuumi. I don't know why I said that like Yoda, but you can only look so good on Yuumi, in my opinion. There's just only so many things that you can show at a pro level that are like, oh wow, you looked fantastic. But Prismo did show those things, and so really impressed with him. I still think he's probably the strongest support in Academy or in the NACL going into this year, but the big problem for GGC is going to be that top side. Concept was very bad in both games. Got completely run off the map by Sniper in lane in a Renekton versus Jax matchup. That should relatively be Renekton favored so long as you know when to trade, and he was just down 50 CS basically both games. Got run over in game number 1. He was a little bit more competent in game number 2 because his team was fighting a lot more in these skirmishes. Rosethorn had a much bigger lead in game number 2, and so Concept was actually able to play the game a bit, but if he didn't have that, if his team wasn't winning, then he was probably doomed. And so definitely not a great showing from him. He continues to look like one of the weaker top laners in the NACL. And then Rosethorn had a rough game 1 on the Wukong, but had a much better game number 2 on the Maokai. I do think Maokai is a little bit of a dummy champion right now. I talk about that on the channel all the time, but you still need to perform on it. And Rosethorn, I thought it looked a lot better when he was able to kind of get back into the game in game number 2. Him and Young had a really good synergy on that Maokai-Sylas duo in game number 2. So overall, Golden Guardians Challengers showed some things. I didn't expect them to actually take a game in this series, so for them to be able to pick up one is pretty big, mostly off the back of Young, who I thought looked really, really solid on this Sylas. Again, Array also played fine on the Zeri. He's just, he picked up a lot of kills towards the back half of the game. It was really Young that was generating a lot of the leads for me. And then 100 Thieves looked really solid. Sniper looks like he is going to be that transcendent top lane prospect that we are all looking forward to. And then Yukino actually looked really solid in the jungle, in my opinion. I don't know what the deal is with Viper and Lightpulse, if they're going to be in all week, or if it's going to be switched out as soon as, Unforgiven and Destiny are able to play for 100 Thieves, but they actually looked pretty solid as well. Definitely surprisingly good. And so overall, both of these teams kind of showing some things, but you kind of wanted a little bit more from 100 Thieves, in my opinion. Moving on to series number 4 here of day 1, we had another matchup that was between a top team and a bottom team, at least in my opinion, a Challengers team and a Provisional team. We had Cloud9 Challengers taking on FlyFam, and FlyFam actually has some interesting players. I ranked them pretty highly in terms of the amateur Provisional teams, but they were just not on the same level as Cloud9 Challengers, who are able to take this series relatively easily. Game 1 was a complete blowout from this Cloud9 team, and Game 2 wasn't particularly close either, and so a lot of good to take away for C9C in this series, most notably Eminus in the mid lane. An absolutely phenomenal showing. This was everything that he showed as a good thing, I would say, over in the NLC last year. Obviously, I talked about it in the power rankings. I watched a lot of Eminus, and his hands are unbelievable. His mechanics and his ability to lane were incredible, but he would have this weird ability to just be in the wrong place towards the back half of the game, to be split pushing when he shouldn't be, to be in team fights when he shouldn't be, etc., etc. He just kind of had this weird ability to not be where he needed to be, and he was set up for a lot of those kills in the early game. They played through him really well. I was really interested to see how he was going to kind of compete with, I don't want to say different talent around him. I don't want to say worse, because I don't think they have worse talent than what he had on BTXL, but just different talent around him, and I think it really showed up in this series, especially obviously game 1 on this LeBlanc, where it felt like he was just solo killing everybody on the map over and over and over again. Poor Blaze had absolutely no chance in this series being able to play on that Talia. Very, very, very much outclassed him. Eminus is a very easy choice for player of the series. He was the complete standout player for C9C, and there's a real chance he's the best mid laner in the NACL, like basically from day 1. His hands have basically already been there. I just didn't necessarily see his entire package as being there, especially with some of the other mids that they had in the NACL that I was really high on. I didn't know if Eminus was going to be there right now, but it seems like he might be right now, which is really, really solid. I think the other players that played really well, obviously Topside played well, although it wasn't super impactful. Fake God was kind of just destroying Lunacia. It just didn't really matter in the long run. I think even if Lunacia was able to keep up, it wouldn't have necessarily mattered, but Fake God absolutely brutalized him in that top lane matchup in both games. Tomio was good, although I don't think Goo was particularly bad. And then bot lane, I thought looked really, really solid. Most specifically, Zeyzal. I was actually really surprised that Zeyzal looked as good as he did. Obviously, he hasn't played competitively in over a year, and when he last did for Evil Geniuses, he was kind of meh at best in the LCS, and so coming back here, I had tempered expectations for Zeyzal. I had him mid-tier in terms of the supports, but he looked pretty awesome in this series. Someone who definitely stepped up and showed that he was able to play a lot of these more meta bot lanes incredibly effectively. The Lulu in game 1 was really good. The Nami in game number 2 was also really, really good, and so for Cloud9, a lot of really good performances, I would say, overall. And then for FlyFam, definitely a little disappointing. Obviously, top side of the map was always going to be a little bit of a question mark going into this year because all of them are so ridiculously unproven. Lunacia, Goo, and Blaze have all really just kind of emerged on the scene. All of them really just playing amateur recently or, you know, getting a shot at this level recently. It's Instinct and Sword that are kind of the more, I would say, experienced members of this FlyFam team, and they were supposed to be the ones that had to quote-unquote carry the load, and while they were okay in this series, FlyFam kind of got blown out of the water in both games. Like I said, Lunacia was just not on the same level as Fake God for either of these two games, and then Blaze was just, I mean, he was just brutalized by Eminus in the mid lane. Blaze is unfortunately going to get my dud of the series for the first series of the year. Obviously, he can bounce back, he's a good player, but going up against Eminus, it's just a tough way to start your season. He got solo killed like 3 times before 10 minutes in game number 1. It was really not good. That LeBlanc was absolutely devastating. It was unfortunately a pretty easy choice. So where does that leave both of these teams? Well, FlyFam, you know, still has some upside. They went up against one of the best teams in the league, and obviously a lot of new players. It's going to be very difficult for them to adapt early on. You know, I expect this team to grow as the season goes on. I liked what I saw out of Instinct in terms of positioning, but they were so far behind that it didn't really matter. Not really a lot of positives to take away from FlyFam. You're just kind of hoping that they're going to be able to bounce back in the series to come. And then for Cloud9 Challengers, I mean, this was dominant. I mean, this was just them being better as a team. They didn't really have to make a ton of these crazy macro decisions. The games were really never close. They were never in doubt. They were just winning from early on and just translating that into easy victories because their hands were better. It's going to be interesting to see what happens when these two teams play against teams that are a little bit closer to their own skill levels, because this just felt like a very mismatched matchup. Jumping into series number 5 now of day number 1, we certainly had a fun one as we had our first kind of upset of the season here as we saw Immortals Challengers taking on Wildcard Gaming, and Wildcard was able to pick up the 2-0. Now, this is a little bit of a surprise, if only because, you know, obviously a provisional amateur team beating a Challengers team is always going to be at least a little bit of an upset, but if you go watch my power rankings, I talked about how I thought Wildcard was certainly going to be better than a lot of the Challengers teams, or at least some of the Challengers teams towards the bottom, and I thought Immortals was a team that downgraded a lot in the offseason. You can go check that out, obviously, in my power rankings video, but that definitely came to fruition. I didn't even expect them to be able to take both games in their first series of the year, but a great look from Wildcard, not so much from Immortals. I gotta say this first and foremost, Immortals not running their main Academy roster. They have a Blaze Olive in here, who is their starting LCS mid laner, but Balulu is having visa problems. Big shocker. That's kind of a theme in the NACL over the course of the first week. So Blaze Olive is playing here, but that honestly should make them better. Blaze Olive is a better player than Balulu, in my opinion, at least watching the tape. And so for Wildcard to come in and just win Like, and to look really good doing it their way, that is about as good as you can ask for. Player of the series, so easy to pick in this one. It's got to be Moose Hater. How can you not pick Moose Hater? We were just talking about Sniper a few sections ago, talking about, you know, this big up-and-coming top laner that could really dominate and really capture a lot of eyes and be super exciting as an LCS prospect. That's Moose Hater for me as well. He played Zac in game number 1 and destroyed the Jace. What a really fun counter pick matchup there. And then he pulls out the Garen in game number 2 and looks absolutely unstoppable. I mean, this is what you want to see. This is fun. This is explosive. This is creative. Love Moose Hater. Easy choice for player of the series. I was really high on him going into the year. You can hear all about that in the power rankings. I think I said something similar to the fact of if he ended up being a top 3 or 4 top laner in the region or in the NACL by the end of spring, I wouldn't be surprised at all. I expect him to be a lot better than people give him credit for. Man, did he really show up here in game number 1. Super fun to watch. And then big credit to the solo lane partner here as well in Celigo, who I think really did a lot of damage in game number 2 on this Azir. 2 games that were, you know, in Wildcard's favor. They needed to close out. Celigo really helped out a lot. I think he's primed for a bounce back here on a team that I think has just a tad bit more cohesion around it than what he had on Evil Genius's Academy last year, where it just felt like everything wasn't quite clicking on that same level. Credit to Duo King and Lens as well. Obviously, a nice little duo in the bot lane. They played the Kalista Blitzcrank 2 games in a row, trying to get into that Zeri Yuumi, trying to be a little bit more effective in that regard. I would say they played well, but Zeri and Yuumi did get online eventually, as they tend to do, and so not really much you can do about that. But overall, for Wildcard, you got to be super excited with how this first series played out, especially on that top side, and really the solo laners in general. They looked fantastic. And then for Immortals, frustrating. I mean, you brought in some players who you would hope would stabilize your team a bit. A player like ADD was at Worlds last year. I know obviously he didn't play particularly well at Worlds, but still, making Worlds is an accomplishment. I know a lot of people just consider him a feeder because he played bad at the tournament, but you have to remember, he's one of the very few players to actually make the World Championships last year. Even if he didn't play all that well at them, it's still pretty hard to make the World Championships. Unfortunately, he didn't really show that up in game number 1 here. Just got outplayed by Moose Hater, was completely run down by this Garen, especially in game number 2 on the Gangplank. Not really a lot you can do. There's not a lot that you can cleanse on Garen. If you're just getting run down, you're just going to die if you're out of position, and unfortunately for ADD, he was out of position a lot, so he's actually going to be my dud of the series in game number 1 here, but he certainly was far from the only player on Immortals to play bad. I thought Chad just got out jungled by Keel and really had no pressure. Obviously, Immortals was down in a lot of these games, losing pressure in their lanes. It can be relatively difficult to play jungle if your laners are losing, especially if your solo laners are getting pushed in and losing, like both ADD and Ablaze Olive were in this series, but it is worth noting that Chad didn't particularly respond to it all that well. 2 games of Poppy are not exactly what I want to see into Wukong. Maybe something that has a little bit more agency, especially if your laners are going to be losing. And then Ablaze Olive, you really needed to see him play a lot better. Obviously, as an LCS caliber mid laner, he should have been able to come in and play relatively solid, but Celigo's far from a slouch. These two have played each other a lot over the years. Celigo getting the better of him in lane isn't particularly, like, demoralizing. It's just got to be a little bit frustrating for Immortals. Obviously, maybe there are some synergy issues. Maybe you haven't been practicing with ABO. You know, whatever it is, you know, there could be some excuses, but at the end of the day, this is a Challengers team that they should be able to win. Like, if you are a Challengers team facing off against a provisional amateur team, you should be able to win the series. That you should be able to win that. There really shouldn't be a lot of question marks, or at the very least draw it. To lose both games to Wildcard is definitely concerning for an Immortals team that I do think got worse. Credit to Wixie, he tried his absolute best in a lot of these late games to be able to win. However, his positioning certainly wasn't perfect. I still think he is a very good prospect, and I'm excited to see him grow over the year. I think he's probably going to be the main win condition for this IMTC team over the course of the year, but it just wasn't enough in this one. They were a little bit too far behind for his Zeri to be able to pull them back. So for IMTC, you got to get better. I mean, you got to see some level of improvement from this top side. ADD cannot be getting run over. That is going to be a problem if he continues to do that. And Chad just simply has to have more impact on the game. As for Wildcard, Moose Hater looks phenomenal. Celigo looks like he's going to be great. And Duo King, honestly, especially on that Blitzcrank, I thought looked really solid. Those are the 3 players that I think really stood out. But this Ginger Turmeric team getting acquired by Wildcard, getting a spot here in the NACL, I think they're going to cause a lot of noise. And I think this is basically just step 1 in that process. Moving on to our final series here of day 1 action, we had a top of the table versus bottom of the table, at least in my power rankings, clash. Although it wasn't quite as simple as that, a couple of visa issues causing this to be a little bit more interesting. We had Evil Genius's Challengers taking on Team Liquid first. And I had EGC as number 1. I had TLF at number 16. I really did like the construction of EGC, and TLF, I think, had a lot to prove to me. And you know what? TLF proved a lot to me in this series. Now, obviously, EGC not fully here. In fact, they're missing 2 of their main players. They're missing Ryoma in the mid lane. They're missing King in the bot lane. And so Robbie Bob and Mobility are filling in 2 pretty good players. I got to watch some tape of them before these games started, and I did like it, especially Mobility. I really do think he's an interesting player to watch, but they're not Ryoma and King, who are top players at this level. And so just looking at how this series played out, I do think it was relatively as expected. Game number 1, really, really fun to watch. Sheedon absolutely took over. Sheedon was a big reason why I was a huge fan of EGC going into the year. I thought, and by the way, if it's Shaden, I'm really sorry. Like, I know it's probably Shaden because everybody else says Shaden, but I've said Sheedon for so long that it's stuck in my head now. So I'll try to be better at that, I promise. Shaden, I think, is one of, if not the best jungler in NACL right now. I think he's a really, really good player, and I expect him to prove that throughout most of the year. He had a great game 1 on the Poppy, was really able to set up everybody. And then, honestly, Robbie Bob and Mobility both played really well. Robbie Bob on the rise was kind of everywhere, creating a lot of plays, really working with Shaden incredibly well to facilitate a lot of macro plays and to get EGC that advantage and for them to be able to keep it. And then Mobility did a ton of damage on the Jhin. That's a champion that I really don't like all that much. I don't think you have a ton of proactivity on it, but if your team is winning, like, Jhin can still do a lot. It's just not going to be nearly as easy. I do like Jhin Ashe kind of as a bot lane, though. I think it's a relatively interesting combo because both of them kind of like playing into each other, and so to have them both on the same team, I do actually think it sets them up relatively well together. But Mobility and Robbie Bob honestly thought they were going to come in and be a little bit of a hindrance in game number 1. They were not. They were both relatively good, helping off the back of Shaden. And then game number 2 for TLF, honestly, they were able to pick up a really solid win. They looked really competent in this game, most specifically Surdy in the top lane on this Fiora. In my opinion, he actually won game number 1 as well. He looked better on that Renekton than Sol did on the Cassante in game number 1. And then game number 2, he really did take over completely, basically on the Fiora. So much so that, in my opinion, actually, Surdy is going to get my player of the series for both sides. I actually thought he was really consistent, really, really good. Obviously, a little bit of a revenge game for him. He was playing for Evil Geniuses Academy last year and got replaced. You know, Sol comes in. Surdy has to go down to TLF, who I don't think nearly has the same kind of cred, at least as a team. And so I definitely think he came into this with a little bit of a point to prove, and I think he absolutely proved it. So, really, really good series from him. Hopefully, he can continue to grow. I thought he was good last year, not great, and so if he can become a really, really solid top laner, TLF is going to be a lot better than I gave them credit for, and honestly, they probably already are. City Woody had a nice bounce back in game number 2. I thought he got kind of run off the map as Elise in game number 1. You really need that early Renekton Elise combo to work out, and Shaden just got super far ahead on the Poppy, and really, there's just not much you can do on Elise at that point. And then, honestly, big shout out to Mia and Rovex. I was not really sure what to expect from this bot lane duo going into the year. You know, I watched them a bit, but they hadn't really played together. I wasn't a huge fan of Evil Genius's prodigies that Mia was coming from, and so it wasn't really super clear to me how they were going to fit in the NACL, like at this second tier of NA level, and they looked really good in their first series. The lethality bot lane here of Varus and Pyke, you know, this instant kill bot lane if you can pull it off. They looked really good, especially in game number 2. Really like Mia's positioning. I think that is something that is going to continue to be a positive for TLF through most of the year. But looking at both of these teams, where do I think they're going to stand? Well, TLF definitely surprised me with how competent they were early on. Not that I thought that they were going to be a bad team. I didn't think anybody in the NACL was like all that far off from being a good team, but to see them be able to take a game off of EGC relatively easily, I think is a huge, huge sign of confidence from TLF, even if it's not the full EGC team. I really do like what they were able to pull off. Their drafts are interesting. They're not going for the same standard comps that everybody else is going for. I do think that gives you a relative advantage here in the NACL. We saw that a bit earlier with some of the other drafts, most notably Wildcards, that you can really gain an advantage in if you want to go that route. And then I think Surdy really looks phenomenal in that top lane. If he can continue to be one of maybe the top 5 or 6 top laners in the region, or in the NACL, I should say, TLF is going to be much better than where I power rank them. As for EGC, I don't want to overreact just yet. I had to give dud of the series to somebody, and unfortunately, it's going to go to Robbie Bob just for that game number 2 on the Galio. I actually thought his game number 1 on the Rise was really good, and definitely, comforting. Like, I think it was a positive, but I think that game number 2 was probably the worst game of the series from anybody. I think you could realistically give dud of the series to Soul in the top lane as well, who he just wasn't as good as Surdy. Surdy kind of ran the map with him both in game 1 and game number 2, but for me, that game number 2 on Galio for Robbie Bob just kind of earned him that dud of the series. It's hard to see where this team goes from here because I need to see their actual lineup before I know how they're going to play, but top lane simply has to be better. Soul is somebody who I really do like. I thought he got better throughout a majority of last year. Shaden, I thought, was really, really good in game number 1 and, was a little bit worse in game number 2, but still someone who I think can dominate this league, has the talent to do so. It'll be interesting to see where this team goes once they actually get their full lineup in place. But for now, I think TLF is going to be looking at this as a huge win to be able to take a game off of EGC, and EGC probably was a little bit relieved to at least not see huge problems out of the players that are filling in. That's going to bring us to the start of day 2 here in the week 1 of NACL action, and we had a really fun series to kick off the day as we saw CLG Challengers take on FlyFam, 2 teams that did play in day 1, getting another shot here in day number 2, and CLG Challengers continues to roll. They go 2-0, FlyFam unfortunately dropping to 0-2, 0-4. Not a great start to the season for them, but honestly, they kept really competitive in this series. I think looking at it on paper, perhaps you would see this as pretty CLGC favored, in terms of the players and just in terms of the matchup. I would agree with that, and I think CLGC did a good job of being able to win this series. However, it was not nearly clean cut. Both games were relatively close, especially game number 1, which really was in FlyFam's favor. So let's go ahead and talk about it game by game, starting with game number 1. Big credit to Copy. They do not win game number 1 without Copy. CLGC doesn't, and I'll spoil it now. Copy, as you can see on the screen, is my player of the series here. He was phenomenal. 2 games of Akali where he can really show off his skills to be able to carry games. That was something that, obviously, I wanted to see more of when it came to CLG Copy rather than C9 Copy. Obviously, no flame to C9 Copy. He was really good at carrying games when he was asked to do it. He just wasn't asked to do it all that much. And so I really wanted to see him be a little bit more aggressive with these picks, a little bit more aggressive with his playstyle, especially against a player like Blaze, who just had such a poor performance to start the year on day number 1. And I think Copy really came out and played phenomenal. Not only was he controlling the mid lane, not only was he controlling really the jungle matchup as well for a majority, even though I want to give credit to Gua, and we'll get to that. But he was controlling the late game. He was inside waves, shoving out. He was in team fights, absolutely blowing up somebody on the back line, whether that was Blaze on the Azir or whether that was Instinct in both games. It was really difficult for FlyFam to actually be able to position in these fights when they had such a fed Akali to have to deal with, and a ton of engage on the side of top lane here. Obviously, we have the Sejuani both games, and then Jenkins playing the Kled in game number 1, which actually did help out a ton, I would say. Really do enjoy that pick. I think at a pro level, it's very fun to watch. I think if you're looking at negatives on the side of CLGC, at least in game number 1, for me, it's actually going to be Meech's positioning. Now, I talked about this in the first series of the year for CLGC, where Meech might just be the most mechanically talented player in the world, but sometimes I feel like he just brain farts into bad positions. He did that a couple of times, I would say, in game number 1. Blaze was actually able to get really strong towards the mid to later portion of that game on the LeBlanc, basically just from farming the Lucian. And, sometimes you can blame that a little bit on the Lucian for being out of position. You could sometimes blame that on the Nami for not being able to peel well enough, but there's really only so much you can do at points. I want to just see more consistency come out of the CLG bot lane. That was my big takeaway that I said in my power rankings when the season started, is that Meech and Breezy absolutely have the talent to be one of the best bot lanes in the league, but they just need the consistency. But for the most part for CLGC, the series was Copy through and through, game 1 and game 2. Now for FlyFam, certainly not bad. This was a much better showing, in my opinion, than what they had in series number 1 this year, where series number 1 was definitely not a good showing. I would say they kind of just got run off the map. They were really not close at all in that series. I think this one was a lot closer, and they definitely showed some interesting things. I actually think Goo had some really good early games on the Maokai. Obviously, don't love this idea of giving over Maokai on red side, but you know what? Like, clearly it wasn't enough to stop them. Instinct and Sword, I think, looked a lot better here, but it was really Blaze in the mid lane that I think really showed up and showed why he was getting a spot here in the NACL. He had such a bad series to kick off the year against Eminus and against Cloud9. He was just completely obliterated in that series. He gets a nice bounce back here, especially in that game 1 on the LeBlanc, but even in game 2 on the Azir, he really wasn't all that bad. Unfortunately, I do have to give a dud of the series here, and that for me is going to go to Lunacia in the top lane position. He wasn't particularly awful. He just didn't really accomplish all that much, and I thought Jenkins was just more useful, especially on that Kled game in game number 1. I will say it is pretty difficult to give a dud of the series, though, in this series, where I think all 10 players definitely played their role, but as we all know, I have to give out one. That's part of the channel. It's what I do. And so it's going to go to Lunasi. I still think he needs to step up. He's probably going to be one of the weaker top laners in the NACL, unfortunately, throughout the year. But that should be fine. If he can continue to grow, obviously, if he can get to somewhere around like 11 or 12 in terms of top lane instead of closer to like 14, 15, 16, that's going to be fine for FlyFam. They have talent on this team. I like the bot lane, even if they haven't really shown up and been like super carries so far this year. And Blaze and Goo, I thought, showed some pretty good things over the course of these 2 games. Unfortunately, was not enough for them to be able to pick up a win, but certainly a better showing from FlyFam than what they had in their first series of the year. And then for CLGC, again, pretty solid series. Credit to Copy. He has come into CLGC and immediately been one of their better players. Meech and Breezy just need to get back on the same page. If they can do that, they're going to be one of the best teams in the league. They have the talent to do that. I'm just a little bit worried about their consistency of being able to beat some of the better teams. They were able to take down CLG Faith in their first series and then FlyFam here, but it'll be interesting to see what happens when they start playing off against some of the more experienced challengers teams, because right now they're just kind of cruising. It'll be interesting to see what happens when they're challenged by a really, really good team. Jumping into our second series of the Block 1 time here on day 2. We had a fun matchup between 2 debuting teams this year. We had TSM Challengers taking on Dignitas Challengers. 2 teams that I think are kind of in very interesting situations. Obviously, TSM's received a lot of flack for the Boomer team, Hanser, Svenskera, and Wild Turtle. And honestly, Dragku's kind of in that as well. Unfortunately, Dragku, an OS player, which means he did not get a visa in time. As we all know, OS players really struggled to get visas here, so it's actually going to be Chime that is playing. Chime is a very, very good player, especially for this level, so I expect that to be a positive. And then Dignitas is rolling out their whole roster. They do have everybody here, but I actually had pretty high expectations for this Dignitas team, mostly based off the fact that this jungle mid duo should theoretically be one of the best in the entire league. And so what ended up happening in the series, well, Dignitas took a very close game number 1 off of the back of pretty much what we expected this team to be going into the year, which was XU kind of controlling the pace on an early game jungler, something like a Lee Sin that obviously he's very known for. I think he did a really good job in game number 1. Obviously, you had Tomo getting really far ahead on the Zeri, and basically from that point in the game, it is over. There's not a lot that you can do. I like Lucian Nami in the Lucian versus Zeri lane. I think Lucian Nami does have the advantage, but if you don't win that, if Zeri is able to generate her own lead, it is typically free for Zeri. It is typically a lot easier for Zeri to be able to win these team fights. You had a player like Insanity doing a lot of the macro work. And then Diamond played really well on the Lulu. I think game 1 overall was just really solid for Dignitas. But game number 2 was, TSM. It was TSM all the way from moment 1 to the end of the game. Doxa played really well on that Syndra in game number 2. Hanser played phenomenally on the Cassante. It kind of leads me into a conversation that I do want to have about Cassante. I talk about this all the time in my other recaps on the channel about how Cassante just feels so ridiculously strong and so ridiculously easy to play right now at a high level, and I don't think that's necessarily fair to say. I don't think he's quite like Maokai, Lucian, Zeri level of just brain dead pick this champion no matter what, like first pick blue side kind of thing. I do think he is very strong, but I do think that there is a difference between a good Cassante and a bad Cassante, or a top player playing Cassante and a lower tier player playing Cassante, and I think the biggest example of that to me is game 1 versus game 2 in this series in particular. Hoon gets Cassante in game number 1. He looks fine, but certainly not like dominant. I think you could make a real argument that Hanser was better than him in game number 1. And then game number 2, Hanser just runs over everybody on this Cassante pick. It is not even remotely close. He shows the power that that champion can have. For me, Hanser's going to get my player of the series here. He was somebody who I was really excited to see on this team. Not only was he really good the last time we saw him competitively, maybe not, maybe the last time, because Academy Hanser was okay, but when he was on Golden Guardians, last time he was in the LCS, he was really, really solid. But this is a guy who's been grinding out solo queue over the past year. He was near the top of the ladder pretty much all of 2022. I was really excited to see him get another shot here in the NACL, and he really has made the most of it at the start of the year here, even in the counter matchup with the Gwen. And so, overall, really, really good series from Hanser. He's going to get player of the series. Svenskeren played game number 2 on the Sejuani beautifully. Really liked how he played into that. Graves can be something a little bit difficult to try and play into, especially when it's a player as aggressive as XU, but Svenskeren did a really good job. And then credit again to Doxa. I was actually very low on Doxa coming into the year. I thought he was going to be a little bit of a problem for this TSM team. Not that he would hold them back entirely on his own, but just that I didn't necessarily think he was going to be a superstar at that mid lane position when there really does feel like there are a lot of really, really good mid laners at the challenger level, at the mid lane position in particular, but he was really good in this first series of the year. I think you can make a real argument that he was just better than Insanity, who I had as my #1 mid laner going into the year. So good series from pretty much everybody on TSM, and honestly, it's good to see if you're a TSM fan. You know, these players should be performing at this level, obviously. Hansers, Svenskar, and Wild Turtle, Chime, all of them should be too good for this level. They all have a plethora of LCS experience and like top level LCS experience. All of them have been to Worlds with the exception of Chime, but I mean, Chime's been in the playoffs and etc. So they all should be too good for this level, and I think they are kind of proving that right now, or at least they looked good in the opening salvo. But Dig was at least able to pick up a game in game #1 again on the back of XU's Lee Sin, who I think he played really well in this series. Tomo and Diamond I thought were relatively good, obviously coming over from FlyQuest. They're going to need to have a really solid split, but what really bothered me for Dignitas was the level that these solo laners were at the beginning of the year. Now, Hoon is someone who I've always been a lot lower on than a lot of other people. I don't really see it in Hoon. I don't think he's ever going to be like LCS caliber. And he kind of did get run off the map by Hanser in game #2 here in a counter pick matchup. And then he got the super strong pick in game #1 and didn't necessarily look fantastic. I think Hoon is definitely kind of lower on the totem pole for me. But my dud of the series is actually going to go to Insanity. I think game #1 he had some really good plays with Rise. He was certainly affecting the game even if it didn't show in the scoreboard. But game #2 was a bad game. Like, he just got completely outplayed by Doxa, and that really can't happen. I had Doxa as the worst mid. I had Insanity as the best mid as my projected player rankings going into 2023. That clearly was wrong. Insanity does need to step up. Obviously, he's a player that has been very good in the past, was really good last year, has been good at, decent at an LCS level before. I do believe that he will eventually get it to click, but I honestly don't even think he was really all that good in this series. So a lot of room for improvement, in my opinion, from this Dignitas team, even though they were able to take a game. That shows good signs for the future because it means that ideally they are going to be able to get their shit together and maybe even perform a little bit better than this going into the future, but you're going to need more than just XU and Tomo really holding up their end of the bargain if Dignitas wants to be one of the best teams in the NACL. But for TSM, really good start to the year. I think they looked like the better team in this series, and that's definitely comforting. What you're looking for here is a team that wants to compete to win the NACL. That's why you bring in a lot of these veteran players. Hopefully they're going to be able to do that. I think series #1 was a pretty good start and a pretty good movement in that direction. Moving on to our third series here of day #2. We had an interesting one. Certainly not a close one, but definitely an interesting one, as we saw Team Liquid Challengers take on Golden Guardians Challengers. And man, TLC just blew them out of the water. This felt personal. I know it wasn't. Obviously, none of these players are, they hate each other or anything like that. But man, Team Liquid came into this one with a mentality that we are going to obliterate and destroy our opponents, and they executed on that in incredibly dominant fashion. This series was not at all close. Game #1 obviously goes to TLC off of the back of APA just running around and obliterating everybody on this Ahri. He was everywhere doing a ton of damage, a ton of versatility. Mir does so much in this game on the Vi. I always talk about how you need to be better on Vi to be able to perform on it. Well, Mir was better today by a considerable margin. The team was better. Arrow and Kim Down did a really good job of taking the advantage that they had with the Caitlyn Lux lane and being able to translate that into some mid-game pressure to outdo what Lucian Nami is really ever going to be able to perform. And then Bradley, I mean, how do you just dominate a Gangplank into K'Sante matchup quite like he did? I mean, game 1 was really not even close, and then game 2 was even worse. I mean, everyone tries to dive Bradley top lane, but he ends up just getting like a 5v2 pentakill. Shout out, Jax. Sometimes you're just too strong. APA does a lot of really good work roaming around the map, and Mir on the Wukong is really nice. And then Arrow and Kim Down show that they are honestly just better now, taking the Lucian Nami themselves and being able to dominate the matchup. I mean, TLC came out for blood in this series. There's really no other way to put it. They looked dominant. They looked scary to play against. I can't think of a single moment in this series where it felt like they did not have complete and utter control. I mean, they won game 2 in 19 minutes. Like, it was an abomination. I mean, APA looked dominant on the Ahri, especially in game #1. But Bradley, for me, is a pretty easy choice for player of the series. I mean, an unbelievable performance from Bradley. I was critical of him in their first series of the year. I really wanted to see him be a little bit more aggressive, especially against top laners that I think he should be able to beat. Well, Concept is a top laner that he should be able to beat, and he showed that in this series. He dominated Concept. He looked phenomenal in this series. Easy choice for player of the series. That Jax game in game #2 was absolutely devastating. I feel bad, though, because APA absolutely deserves it as well. He was stellar in this series, again, especially on that Ari in game number 1. I think in 90% of the series of the year so far, he would have been player of the series. Unfortunately, both Bradley and APA absolutely went nutty in this one. And big credit to Mir as well on both the Vi and the Wukong for being able to facilitate a lot of the action that ended up going on. TLC just looked utterly dominant. As for Golden Guardians, yikes. I mean, this team is now really not looking good. They were able to squeak a win by 100 Thieves earlier in the week, but they got decimated here, and honestly, I'm a little bit concerned about them as a team. I really like Young. I think he's playing really well, especially on these more assassin-oriented picks, things like the Akali, although his Aurelia was pretty good too. I don't think there's much talent around him. I think Concept looks like maybe the worst player in the NACL right now. Obviously, that might be a little bit of a hyperbole, but he is not good. Like, he is getting run off the map by pretty much everybody he's played against. Rosethorn has really not caught on in the way that you really wanted him to. He has not nearly been the kind of impact in the jungle that you need him to be. He has lost basically every matchup that he has been in. And honestly, Prismal, someone who I had super high hopes for going into the year, just has been kind of mediocre. I think Array and Prismal were okay in game number 1. Here on the Lucian Nami, I think they held their own, but everything fell apart in game number 2. Not going to entirely blame them, but it is worth noting that it's not even like they're particularly winning their lanes. It's just kind of meh. It really is just Young versus the world when it comes to Golden Guardians Challengers through the first 2 series of the year. But Young is a good player, and, obviously no spoiler alerts. He's playing in the LCS, and he is definitely the player of Golden Guardians that you want to be able to get that stage time, because right now he is the only player on Golden Guardians Challengers that is even remotely playing, good at all. I mean, I have to talk about Concept. Of course, he's my dud of the series here. 2 games of Cassante into matchups that, quite frankly, Cassante should just be able to win. Jack should never be able to punish Cassante in the way that he did in game number 2. And, I mean, Gangplank is not even in the same vicinity in terms of being able to face off against that champion. And Concept lost both matchups incredibly hard. He has had 0 impact on his team's success and on his team's games. And that is a problem. That is a major problem, I would say, going into the rest of the split. If he does not step it up, and him and Rosethorn really need to be the 2 that step up, because right now both of them are playing bad. If those 2 continue on their bad pace, they might not even be like a top 14 team, like the way that they played in this series. Again, I feel bad for Young, but it just feels like disaster when it comes to Golden Guardians right now. We knew going into the year that they were probably going to be the weakest of the LCS Challenger teams, but I did not think it was going to be by this much. This top side is dreadful at the moment. For TLC, clearly this was a okay, I'm just going to go out there and dominate. We wanted to go 2-0 in our first series. We didn't get to do that. Golden Guardians is going to suffer the consequences. And they did that. Bradley with a fantastic bounce-back game. APA looking monstrous to start the year. Mir looking good. Arrow looking good. Kim Down looking good. This entire TLC team looked unbelievably good in this series. If they can keep up this pace, they're going to be one of the best teams in the league, like this org has been pretty much for the entirety of their existence. It's just the fact that I don't know, man. Golden Guardians almost looked worse than I could ever expect a team like TLC to ever expect to play again. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens when TLC maybe plays a team that has a little bit more cohesion and a little bit more consistency throughout the rest of the year. Moving on to the 4th series here of day number 2. Certainly an interesting one. 2 teams that I don't think were at the top of my power rankings, but one of them really showing that they deserve to move up, quite frankly. We had the Cincinnati Fear taking on CLG Faith, and I'll say it, I was way too low on this Fear team because they are good. Like, they are not just okay, they are good. They have a lot of good players, and a lot of them know how to play both from ahead and from neutral, which is very rare here in the NACL. This team is way going to outperform my expectations of having them at number 15. So let's go ahead and talk about what this series looked like. These were 2 dominant wins for the Fear. Not quite as dominant as TL in the previous series, but still incredibly strong. They definitely still looked like the better team by like a considerable margin. And a lot of that was off the back of their top side of the map. Now, no flame to their bot lane, but their bot lane was kind of weak side over the course of this series. 2 games of Ashe, you got the Karma, you got the Renata. Still strong, and we'll talk about how they dominated their lane. But this top side was absolutely disgusting. Faisal in game number 1 on the Camille went absolutely nutty, destroyed Bajani over and over and over again on the Cassante pick. This goes back to what I was saying. You do kind of need to know how to be able to pilot the Cassante for it to be the broken pick that it can be at the pro level, and clearly Bajani just didn't quite have that experience. Faisal took advantage of him on that Camille, and then game 2 really was Perry and Shochi all the way. The Vi Syndra combo, not really something that I sit there and go like, holy crap, that's going to take over the entire game, but man, it took over the entire game. There really was not a lot that CLG was able to do. Once that Syndra got online, once Perry was setting everything up in the entire game, NXI was on the Kindred with that Karma, really trying to funnel and make sure that Kindred and the Tristana could really take over in the late game team fights, but they were so far behind that it didn't even really matter. Bot lane lost super hard, mid lane lost super hard, jungle lost super hard, top lane lost super hard. It was just kind of doomed overall for CLG, honestly. But for Fear, I mean, this is exactly what you wanted to see. You wanted to see some of these players that maybe were, I don't want to say bigger question marks, but unproven, come out and really start the year on a high note. And man, have the solo laners done that. Both Faisal and Shochi, two players that I really weren't all that familiar with going into the year. Faisal really impressed me when I was watching. I actually thought he was probably the player I was most interested in out of that entire group of EG Prodigies players from Proving Grounds of last year, and he's really proved that at the beginning of the year. I mean, he looked fantastic in their first series. He looks great here as well. He might be one of the more interesting top laners in all of the NACL. Top lane as a position, if you've noticed, over the course of me talking about all of these series, is probably one of the more interesting, if not by far the most interesting role in the NACL right now. So many good young top laners, but I really do believe that the upper tier of interesting top laners and the lower tier of top laners that are maybe a little bit overmatched at this level are definitely beginning to separate themselves here, and Faisal definitely is moving into that upper category. We'll talk about Bajani, who unfortunately I think is in that lower category in a bit, but player of the series for me is actually going to go to Perry in the jungle. Now, Perry is someone who I really like. I've been very high on him throughout the course of this channel's history. When you look at last year, when he came in for Dignitas, I was super high on it. The way he played at Proving Grounds, I was super high on. I really just liked Perry as a player, and I think generally speaking, he was underrated going into this year, at least by perception, and I think he started off the year fantastic. The Wukong game in game number 1 was really solid. The Vi game in game number 2 was really solid. I think you can make a case that Faisal was player of the game in game 1 and Shochi was player of the game in game 2, but Perry was kind of the bridge for both of them to be able to take over, and so he's going to get my player of the series overall for Fear. But again, Shochi looking great, more of that control mage style. It's kind of what we knew him as going into the season. I talked about that in my power rankings video, but he plays it so effectively and so aggressively that honestly, it just doesn't really feel like a control mage style. It feels like an aggressive mid, and that's kind of how he played the Syndra. He played it really well with the Vi, got a lot of pressure from it, was able to push forward. And then Manui and Trevor on the bot side were fantastic. I mean, holy crap, did that Ashe take over the bot lane. Zeri should not be able to be this useless, I would say, throughout a majority of the game, but holy crap, game 1 was nothing from Zeri. Game 2 on the Tristana, you really need to punish that in lane. Like, Tristana has to win early, and so if you're able to gain that lead over Tristana, then she's absolutely doomed, and that's kind of what happened. Manui on the Ashe was just super far ahead. You know, CLG tries to take the Karma away in order to facilitate the Kindred and the Tristana a tad bit more, but you're never going to get to the point in the game where you're able to actively use that combo if you're not winning early, and unfortunately, for CLGF, they were not winning early. Everybody on Fear was clicking today. A really good series from them. And then from CLGF, I mean, it just continues to be a problem. They look like the worst team in the NACL by a large margin right now. They start off the season 0-4, and the solo laners look completely lost. Bajani especially gets Cassante twice, looks completely lost. Does not look like he's able to play at this level. Add that on to a couple of the other top laners that we've already talked about not being able to play at this level. You know, no flame, but players like ADD, Concept, you know, that have really had tough starts to the year. Even someone like Hoon. You know, players that have had really tough starts to the year that really need to prove a lot. Bajani is definitely in that category. Saranok had a good first series of the year. He did not have a good second series of the year. And then this bot lane just got completely rolled. I mean, Sketch went 1-9-1. Plux is going to get my dud of the series. He went 0-9-1 in game 2 on the Lulu. That is just inexcusably bad. Nothing is working right now for CLGF. Pretty much the entire team really does deserve dud of the series, but I think Plux most of all was just kind of running it, especially towards the end of that final game. So where do I think CLGF needs to go? Well, they just need to stabilize right now. You need to get something out of somebody. Like, you need to find a player that you can invest in, because right now it feels like all 5 players on the roster are playing below expectations. And that's really not a good sign for you being able to win a lot of games moving forward. You have a lot of time to fix this, to kind of figure out what's going on and to move forward. These players do have talent. I like NXI, I like Sketch. These are 2 players that I do like mechanically speaking, but everybody on this team is playing below expectations right now, and you really just need to figure out a way to get them back on track. As for Fear, great start to the year. Your top side looks unbeatable. Your bot lane looks really good as a self-sufficient kind of weak side bot lane. This is basically everything that you want to see out of an academy, or I'm sorry, an amateur team, a provisional amateur team, and you've just got to be really impressed. Hopefully they can keep up this form even against some of the better teams in the league. Moving on to our 5th series here of day 2. We had a fun one. Actually, probably one of the most fun series to watch all weekend. Probably my series of the weekend for NACL. It was FlyQuest Challengers taking on AoE Gold, and it's a 1-1, and it really shouldn't have been. FlyQuest did pull out game number 2. They were behind a lot throughout the game number 2. Couple of clutch mistakes coming in from AoE that gives FlyQuest a chance to get back into that game, but overall, a really good showing from an AoE team that I was super impressed with, because I thought FlyQuest was going to go into this year with a really big chip on their shoulder. Players like Philip, Yuji, Spirax, I was really high on them as a trio going into 2023. Yuji and Spirax felt like they just got better every single game over the course of 2022, and Philip obviously was way better than anyone expected in the LCS last year, and so really liked their chances of coming in and being kind of dark horse favorites for the NACL this year. But man, AoE looked fantastic to start this year, and that feels really good. These are a lot of players that we've all been cheering for. Obviously, Winnie, Lynx, and Skytech all played together last year. Gamsu played, in LCS, in Academy, throughout everywhere, and Darkwings has just been around the block quite a bit. Dignitas, 100 Next, etc., etc. And so a lot of players that I think a lot of North American fans are really big fans of, to see them really come out in their first game here in the NACL and look as good as they did, or the first games, I should say, that's really comforting. Game number 1 was an AoE win off of the back of Lynx. I mean, Zeri, Yumi, come on, when you get to that point in the game, it's going to be very difficult to deal with. I do like the idea of going for Sivir Lulu as a counter pick. I think it's almost underutilized in the meta right now. Sivir is just a good pick. I don't think she's nearly as dominant as she was last year, obviously, but I do think she still does the things that she does really well, which is when you get to that 3rd, 4th, 5th item, there really aren't a lot of champions in the game that can front it back as well as Sivir, and especially if you pair that up with like an Azir, and you have Peel on the side of like Sejuani and Lulu, and you've got Camille who can do a lot of that as well. There are a lot of different avenues for you to be able to win those fights. Unfortunately, on the side of FlyQuest, Lynx was just better. In game number 1, he was dominant. He was given a lot of resources in his own right. Like you look at this comp and you're like, oh, this is a Zeri comp. Like, she's going to have to win you the game. And luckily for AoE, she did win them the game. So big credit to Lynx. And then game number 2 does go to FlyQuest, but it certainly is not an easy game by any means. AoE actually had pretty big control over the game up until the 3rd dragon, where it just felt like they walked into it and didn't really expect a lot of pushback and got pushback and were not ready to fight, and then just lost basically their entire lead from there. A really good snowball chance from FlyQuest, not to take away from them. They played it exactly as they should have. Big credit to Masu, and big credit especially to Yuji, who I thought played really well in that 2nd game, but AoE really had control of that one, and it was really on them that they lost it. And so overall, I think you're looking at this from an AoE perspective and saying, we kind of were the better team today, which is a really good sign. Lynx is going to get my player of the series. Like I said, he was fantastic in game 1, but he was still pretty solid in game number 2. Not nearly as much of a takeover threat because the game just kind of went in a different direction. It didn't go 50 minutes like game number 1 did, but still a really solid performance from this bot lane from AoE, which in my opinion felt like the biggest question mark. I think we all kind of know what the top side of this map is going to look like. Gamsu is a really solid top laner, not really someone who's going to win you games by himself, but not really someone who's going to run it down, right? Winnie's been in the system forever, and he's always been really solid as a jungler. I'm a huge fan of Darkwings. I talked about that a ton in my power rankings video. Lynx and Skytech were really the biggest question marks for me personally heading into 2023, and they looked great. They were the best part of this AoE team in this series, so really good showing from them. As for FlyQuest, you wanted to see a tad bit more. I do think there were some really good moments, most notably Yuji, who I thought was spectacular over the course of this series. He looked like the better jungler over Winnie, which is very surprising. Winnie is certainly not a pushover in the jungle position, but Yuji definitely looked really solid. I was expecting a breakout season from him. I kind of called that in my power rankings video, him and Spirax. I expected breakout seasons from both of them over the course of this year. Yuji definitely got that out to a strong start. Spirax maybe not so much. Now, he wasn't awful this series. Again, this was a battle between two teams that I think were relatively close for a majority of both of these games, and so dead of the series was a little bit more difficult to assign just straight up. But Spirax, generally speaking, I wanted to see a little bit more out of him. In game number 1, he just wasn't all that effective on the Azir in the late game. He should be outputting just as much damage as the Cassiopeia, and it just didn't feel like that was happening. And then game number 2, he did get a little bit lucky, I would say, with how the end of the game ended up playing out. And so Spearax is going to get my dud of the series, and Lynx is going to get my player of the series. But overall, looking at both teams, they both looked really good in this series, most specifically AoE. I'm not going to hit the panic button if I'm FlyQuest Challengers just yet. I still think that there was a lot of season, and AoE is clearly a good team, but this is another example of one of those provisional teams coming in to the NACL and really being able to show that they are on the same level as a lot of these Challengers teams. They weren't able to win both games, but they were the dominant team in the series, and if you're an AoE fan, which very slowly, I think I am becoming one of those, it's hard not to like this team, and I think a lot of people are probably going to follow in my footsteps with that. The more that this team gets to play, the more they're going to gain some fans, and the more they gain fans, I think the more interesting it's going to be as the season moves on. That brings us to our final series here of Day 2 in the NACL, and it was an interesting one that I thought would perhaps be a little bit more lopsided, but again, not really the kind of dominant win that I thought it would be. We saw Immortals Challengers taking on 100 Thieves Challengers, and I honestly thought 100 Thieves had this in the bag. I assumed that the form that Immortals was in was going to really hamper their ability to win games, but I was wrong. They were able to take a game here, game number 1, in fact, and honestly, big shout out to Wixie, one of the most bold things that I've seen in a while. Unforgiven and Destiny are in for 100 Thieves. They were able to make it here for game number 2 in their season, but Wixie is not afraid. He is picking Draven in his first game against Unforgiven, in Unforgiven's first game in the NACL. And you know what? Wixie played awesome on this Draven. Joey did a great job supporting him on the Nami. It's always up or down when you get this, Nami-Lucian split. It can always be good or bad. Really, typically speaking, this doesn't happen if you see Nami first pick. It really only happens when you see Lucian first pick. Teams are much more comfortable trading the Lucian for the Nami if they can get the Nami. And so Wixie goes for the Draven. They feel pretty comfortable with that, and honestly, he plays really well. Big credit to Ablaze Olive as well on this Silas. He played really well in game number 1. Those were the two players that I think really stood out for Immortals. And then Chad. I think Chad actually played much better. I've been a little bit lower on Chad, I think, than a lot of other analysts. A lot of people I've seen put him as one of the top junglers in the region. I think there are so many good junglers in the NACL right now. Chad feels like he has a lot of question marks for me. He definitely has the talent to be one of the best. He has shown flashes of being one of the more interesting prospects in all of North America before, but really never put it together over the course of last year on Immortals. This was a really good game number 1 from him on the Vi. Unfortunately for them, they're really not able to keep that going as 100 Thieves does bounce back incredibly hard in game number 2. They are able to get the full Lucian Nami combo, and that is disastrous as Unforgiven loses his mind once he gets that Nami in the bot lane to help him out. He completely dominates game number 2, a very easy choice for player of the series, basically just based off of game number 2 itself, because game number 1 was not a very good game from Unforgiven. However, game number 2 was so good and so dominant, I would be remiss not to call him my player of the series. I think the other player that you could give that to is, of course, Sniper in the top lane. He's able to get the counter pick in the top side in game number 1 on ADD. He gets the Gwen to go into the Cassante. And then in game number 2, he himself gets to play the Cassante. ADD brings out the Garen. Of course, we saw Moose Hater bring it out earlier in the season, but I'll talk about this later. ADD is not Moose Hater. Sniper looked really good in this series, and honestly, he's looked really good at this level so far. I would not be surprised at all if he becomes like the NACL MVP by the end of the year. He really is playing like it right now. I think you can make a solid case that he is just kind of better than a lot of the other players he's playing against. I talked about this in the last segment. Some of these top laners are just losing their minds playing really well right now. Sniper might just be at the top of that list. Another really good series from him on 100 Thieves, but again, Unforgiven was really the guy in this series. I think Yukino and Pretty, I was a little bit lower on Yukino going into the season, and I do think that's kind of held up just a tad bit so far. I don't think he's necessarily been bad, but I honestly think Chad was a little bit better. He was definitely better in game number 1, and Yukino was better in game 2, right? But it certainly wasn't this performance that I really wanted to see out of 100 Thieves, where Chad's really been struggling to play against some of the top junglers in the league. I don't think Yukino really punished him in the same way that others did. And then Pretty, I just don't think he's adapted well yet. Blaze Olive is obviously a very good player, but ABO outplayed him in this series, in my opinion. I really think 100 Thieves win was a lot on this bot lane in game number 2, and then Sniper just being better in the top lane. But for Immortals, dud of the game, or dud of the series, I should say, really easy choice here. It's going to go to ADD. He continues to look like maybe the worst top laner in the region. I mean, maybe not the worst. Concept has been pretty bad over the start of this season, but ADD is certainly up there as well. Another really bad couple of games from him. He pulls out the Garen in game 2 and completely feeds away his lead that he has. Just don't really like what's going on up there. ADD is obviously someone who has been known to be a little bit over-aggressive in the top side throughout his career. That was the case in the LPL. That was the case last year in the LLA as well. And so ADD is just someone that you need to keep watching over. He's not someone who I think is going to improve unless the rest of his team really steps up. Like, he has to play from a winning position in order to look like a really strong top laner, and that just really hasn't been where Immortals has been so far. But I do want to give credit where credit is due, and that's the big three, the three middle players, Chad, Ablazeolive, and Wixie here, who I do think played really well in game number 1, even if they weren't exactly able to translate that into game 2. I thought ABO was definitely the best of the three in game 2, but Chad and Wixie fell off just a tad bit, but both of them played really well in that game 1 Immortals win. So where do both of these teams stand? Well, Immortals is just kind of Like, I really don't feel super confident in this team at all. Topside is a disaster. Chad really hasn't been consistent enough for me to feel comfortable, and I don't know what's going to happen once Ablazeolive leaves this team. He was the best player for Immortals in this series, even if Wixie was really good in game number 1. ABO really carried a lot of the I don't want to say consistency role, but he was the best player over the course of the 2 games for sure. It's going to be a little bit interesting to see what happens when Balulu comes in, a player who's not nearly as consistent as ABO, which is crazy to say because ABO is not all that consistent. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens, but so far Immortals just kind of is underwhelming. For 100 Thieves, they continue to look good in the specific areas that they look good in. Sniper is dominating everybody in the top lane. Unforgiven and Destiny had a really good partnership in game 2. Hopefully that can continue. Their first series definitely checked all the boxes. Unforgiven just should be the best player in Academy, or I'm sorry, in the NACL by a large margin. So I would expect him to keep this pace up. If you have questions for 100C, it's definitely going to be this mid-jungle duo. If Yukino and Pretty can get on the same page and kind of get to that spot where Pretty was over the course of last year, I think that's going to be a lot better for 100C. And I think they are going to be a lot closer to that number 2 team in the power rankings that I have them than maybe what they're performing at right now. Because right now it just does feel like a top-heavy team that maybe doesn't have the same kind of depth as some of the other teams in the league. That's going to bring us into our third and final day of NACL action here in week 1. You know, these videos are long to make, but they are worth it because we get a lot of fun games to talk about and another really interesting series here as we saw Evil Geniuses Challengers take on Cloud9 Challengers. 2 of the best teams in the league, in my opinion, but again, unfortunately for EG, they're not going to have their roster by the time this game goes up. Ryoma and King are still not here. Robbie Bob and Mobility are still in, which means that C9C's got a pretty big advantage, and they do take advantage of that advantage. Is that the way to say that? I don't know. Eminus is too good to be playing against a replacement mid. That really is the case right now. C9 is able to take both games here relatively comfortably, and both off the back of Eminus just being incredibly strong. Now, I will say game number 1 was a tad bit more dominant, I would say, from the mid laner here, but I think it's pretty clear to say now at this point that Eminus is going to be one of the top 1, 2, 3 mid laners in the region. Yes, he's played, you know, maybe not the best competition. Blaze and Robbie Bob aren't exactly the toughest people to play against in the world, but what has impressed me the most is not what Eminus was really good at last year for BTXL, which was, of course, his laning phase. He was, of course, really dominant at being able to generate 20, 25, 30 CS leads in the mid lane really consistently. He just had problems being able to translate that into being in the correct spot at the end of the games, but really in NACL, it's a lot about skirmishing. That's really the meta right now, is making sure that you're in the right spot in the mid game to be able to fight over objectives, and holy crap, is Eminus in the right spot. He actually didn't generate, like, massive leads in the mid lane in those matchups by themselves. You can look at the matchups. Vex and Nagalio, not really something you're going to be able to generate a huge lead in. Lux into Victor, certainly not something you're going to be able to generate a gigantic lead in. Usually going to be relatively boring. But what Eminus did really well was fight. And what he did was fight a lot, and it really worked out. Really carried C9C to a dominant victory here, and it really made them look good. I know his deaths are a little high, but that's because he was the central point for pretty much all of these plays, and EG had to spend the entirety of both of these games just at least attempting to try and shut him down, but it wasn't really happening. Big credit to Tomio as well. Looking at the Shaden-Tomio kind of swap that both of these teams went through, it was really interesting. I do believe these are 2 of the best junglers in the region. I'm higher on Shaden, or at least I was last year, but obviously this series was all Tomio. He had a ton of advantages, not only in the jungle, but mostly from his laners, and that's why I don't want to take too much away here. I've seen a lot of discourse surrounding it, like, oh, I guess whoever plays for C9 is just going to be the better player. If it's Tomio right now, then that's great. I don't think it's necessarily that simple. I think it's really difficult to play jungle when your top, mid, and bot are all pushed in all game long, all losing lane, right? And that's kind of what happened to Shaden. It was really difficult for him to have to play the game. Soul was not on the same level as Fake God. Mobility and Smoothie were not on the same level as Lost and Zazel, who did play really well in this series. And like I already told you, Robbie Bob got completely obliterated by Eminus in lane. And so a big credit to Tomio for being able to take advantage of the advantages that his laners gave him, but I don't want to take it away from Shaden. I don't want to sit here and say that he played awful. This really was a jungle mid masterclass from C9 rather than it being like disaster on the side of Evil Geniuses. But really, yeah, Tomio, Eminus, the two players I want to point out on the side of Cloud9. On the side of Evil Geniuses, not a lot really went right in this series. Shaden tried his best, especially in game 2 here on that Poppy pick. I really don't hate how he played. Like I said, I think it could have been better, but Robbie Bob got destroyed in the mid lane matchup. Game 1 was a disaster. Game 2 was a disaster. Like I said, he was able to keep up relatively well in the early laning phase, but as soon as Eminus got any sort of gold from any sort of skirmish or objective or anything like that, it was just game over from the side of Evil Geniuses. There really wasn't a lot you could do. And I'm not exactly sure what to think of this roster right now. You're sitting at 1-3 at the end of week 1, but your two carry roles and arguably your two most important players to the team weren't here. It's really hard to judge where Evil Geniuses is as a team until we actually see their roster perform. So I'm not going to pull the trigger yet on saying that this team is overrated or that I made a huge mistake by putting them at number 1 in my power rankings. I still think they have the talent to be able to get there. I think once Shaden gets some more sustainable, some more stable laners in general, I think he's going to continue to look like one of the best junglers in the entire region. And it'll be interesting to see how things go. But as of right now, it's really not looking all that great. Robbie Bob is going to get my dud of the series again. Like I said, just got completely outclassed by Eminus. Not an awful trait to have. Eminus looks like maybe the best mid laner in the region right now, or at least in the NACL. But Robbie Bob just did not keep up with him, right? He was okay in their first series of the year, especially on that Rise game, but and pretty much every other facet he's been a disappointment. There's really nothing else to say. Hopefully he can get some time. I know he's playing in the Proving Grounds qualifiers, or the NACL qualifiers, and hopefully he can use this experience to kind of grow and build towards the future. It just really wasn't a great showing from him in his first couple of games. Same with Mobility. I do think Mobility was pretty good. There's just not really a lot that they could do here. They keep going back to this Varus Pike lane. That's kind of been the Mobility Smoothie special. Clearly they practice that a lot, but I don't really think it's all that strong. But for C9C, this is about as good as it gets. Your jungle mid looks unstoppable. Your ADC and support are looking really stable, not necessarily dominant. And honestly, Fake God is underratedly really good in the top lane. I think C9C has a real case to be made to be one of the best teams in all of the NACL, especially if Eminus can continue playing at an MVP level. So overall, you gotta be super happy if you're a Cloud9 fan. Jumping into our second series here of day 3. We had a fun one. This was the matchup maybe I was most excited to watch all weekend on paper because it's a battle of the top 2 provisional teams, in my opinion. We had Wildcard Gaming taking on AOE Gold. And Wildcard takes the 2-0 best of 2 win. Absolutely huge from Wildcard. I know people have been really high on AoE, me included. I do like this roster, but I was always a little bit higher on Wildcard. I thought Ginger Turmeric last year was so much fun to watch, and that this team was really going to surprise a lot of people with the addition of Saligo in the mid lane. And man, did that kind of work out. Like, this really is exactly, what I was hoping to see, basically, from this Wildcard team. They look spectacular. Obviously, there are a couple of players that we can delve into being really, really fun to watch in general, but how could you not start with Moose Hater in the top lane, who has very quickly become maybe my favorite prospect in all of North America? I mean, he is just a blast to watch. Garen, Zach, I mean, it is just crazy what he is willing to pull out. I think those are the only 2 champions he's played this year so far. But still, neither of them are all that relevant. Playing Garen into Cassante, that's been a relatively interesting counterpick opportunity, and he has won both times he's now played it. The Zach top, I think, is super underrated as a pick. I think Zach in general is super underrated as a pick right now. Moose Hater being able to flex that between him and Keel in the jungle. They were able to play that in game 1, makes it look awesome. Game number 1 was definitely a blowout. Game number 2, a little bit more of a back and forth early, but does end up turning into a blowout relatively quickly. In both games, Moose Hater looks awesome. He's going to get player of the series again for Wildcard here. Just an absolute blast up in the top lane. He is gonna quickly shoot up, I think, a lot of people's favorite player rankings, and for good reason. Not only is he super fun to watch with a really eclectic champion pool, but he's also really good at the game. Like, he can win a lot of these matchups as well, which is just insane and super duper great. This is the kind of fun that NACL needs. This is the kind of interesting prospect that I think North America has been missing for a little while, or at least over the course of the end of last year. I think Moose Hater could be one of those next guys, along with, like, Sniper, up in the top lane to really be one of the more interesting prospects in all of North America. Really, really good series from him, but let's not take it away from anybody else. I actually want to skip down a little bit here and talk about the player who I thought was really good over the course of the series, and that was Duo King. Duo King is really not someone who I've talked about on this channel all that much. Obviously, has been given some opportunities before, was on FlyQuest Academy a long time ago. I want to say like 2019, 3 or 4 years ago now. Has some reports. I'm not going to get into like whether he's toxic in or out of the game or whatever. I don't play solo queue with him. I don't know. But what I can say is that he's always been a really mechanically talented prospect. And it feels like him and Lens really have a nice synergy together. Lens in general loves to go to this Kalista, which enables Duo King to play these super aggressive engager picks that maybe just aren't as meta, quote unquote, right now. Things like the Blitzcrank that he's now played 3 out of his 4 games, and then the Alistair that he's picked up in the other one. Even things like the Thresh or the Bard that I know he's been able to go to before. Things that work relatively well with the Kalista. I really, really do like this bot lane duo, and I think Duo King in particular has really shown up at the beginning of the year and continues to look good. Keel had a great series, being able to swap between the Engager here and Zac and the more carry-oriented pick in the Kindred that is going to be able to play with the resources. And then Saligo 2 games of Orianna. That's Saligo. I mean, that's what we know Saligo as. He's the guy who's going to pull out the control mages, be incredibly solid in the mid lane, and not really lose. That's what he does at his best, and that's what he did here for Wildcard. And honestly, they look incredibly solid. I'll get to it towards the end, but they might be one of the best teams in the NACL, full stop, not just provisional teams. When it comes to AoE, though, a little bit disappointing that they weren't able to pick up a win here. You would have hoped that they would have been slightly more competitive with this Wildcard team. I know I like Wildcard a lot, but I liked AoE as well, and I was hoping that this was kind of be a more back and forth series, but AoE was definitely at least a little bit outclassed in this one. My dud of the series is going to go to Gamsu in the top lane. And pretty much everybody who has played into Moose Hater so far has been a little bit gapped. That is no exception for Gamsu. He was not very good in this series. There's really no other way to put it. His Cassante in game 1 was completely useless in the Gangplank. You really got to pick it. You can only pick it if you really feel like you're going to be getting to that late game. Unfortunately for AoE, look at this comp. It is Gangplank, Kassadin, Varus. Like, you are relying on being able to get to level 11 as quickly as possible, and Wildcard was just simply never going to let you do that. They have some of the most aggressive players in their roles on the team. I don't really like this draft all that much, and I think they did get punished for it. Gamsu didn't play all that well. He was definitely worse than Moose Hater. Hopefully he can get back to some form that he had closer to 2021. I think 2022 was surprisingly a down year for Gamsu. I didn't really like his LCS time, and he really wasn't all that good when he went back down to Academy either, and so I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just being too low on Gamsu like a lot of people said I was in my power rankings, but he really hasn't shown up this year, and I think he might be a weaker link of the team. And then everybody else on the team was also kind of bad. It's not like it was just him. Lynx and Skytech got run over by Lens and Duo King in that lane. They felt like they needed to take away some of these picks, things like the Renata, things like the Taric, that they didn't want to give over to the other side. But unfortunately, Wildcard just has a different playstyle. Blitzcrank playing into something like a Varus is very difficult to have to deal with. If you get hooked, you are just dead. There's really not a lot that you can actively do about it. It's very similar for someone like a Kassadin before he hits level 11, because he can get out, but like, you just re-engage with Kalista Ultimate. There's really not a lot that he can do there, and so definitely not a great draft overall from AoE, but they didn't play it particularly well either. Lynx and Skytech not looking great, Gamsu not looking great, even Winnie and Darkwings, who I do think had moments, like Darkwings in particular, I think had moments. They didn't look all that great. I think AoE was just kind of outclassed in this one. You're definitely going to look to see some more improvements, but if Wildcard really is as good as we think they might be, this isn't the worst loss in the world. You're just kind of looking at a 1-3 week for AoE and feeling a little disappointed because you felt like they could have accomplished a tad bit more than that, but they're still a really good team, and I still have high hopes for them, just maybe not to the same level that a team like Wildcard is. And Wildcard's awesome. Like, this could legitimately be a top 5, top 4 team in the NACL right now. Moose Hater is playing like an absolute god. Everybody else on the team is pulling their weight. It's going to be interesting to see when they start playing against some of the top teams. I want to see them versus Cloud9. I want to see them versus Dignitas. I want to see them versus, 100 Thieves. I want to see them versus CLG. Like, I want to see those matchups because I think that there are a lot of interesting decisions and matchups in those particular series. And so Wildcard kind of on a roll right now, and hopefully they can continue it as their schedule gets a tad bit harder. Moving on to our third series here of day number 3. We had a pretty interesting matchup, one that I think has gotten more interesting as the week has gone on. We had Dignitas Challengers taking on Team Liquid first. And TLF, I really didn't have a ton of high expectations for them going into the year, but they looked pretty okay in their opening series. Dignitas not really looking as hot as I thought they would at the beginning of the year either, and so I thought this might be a really interesting contest between two teams to really kind of solidify where they're at, and it was that, I guess. It just was very one-sided. Dignitas definitely looking like the better side in this matchup, as they should. This is a Tier 2 organization versus a Tier 3. Obviously, Dignitas Challengers, Team Liquid, and their provisional amateur team. And so, you can't really expect them to be on the same level, but it really wasn't all that close. A great showing from Dignitas here. They go for some pretty wacky drafts. I'm not really sure what the trio of Kassadin, Caitlyn, Lux typically has a win rate of in solo queue, but a very odd draft there of Okay, Insanity's going to be super passive until the late game because he's Kassadin, but we're going to invest super heavily into this bot lane to try and get a lead. Like, I understand wanting to transition things from the early game to the late game, but you can maybe fall apart in the mid game here. You don't really have a lot of pressure in that specific area if, you know, something like the Kindred or the Galio do become a problem. You don't really have a lot of answers to it. Luckily for them, it didn't matter. It ended up working out. And then game 2, I actually love this draft. I think this draft is super duper fun. You take away the Nami and you give Lucian to the other side. I think that is a totally fair trade. The Nami always wins that trade, in my opinion. You go for the Yone in the mid lane, which I think is a really solid pick. Brand AD carry? Go ahead. Yeah, sure. Like, I'm all in. Brand bot lane, I think, is super fun. As an AP carry down there, I think especially into something like Lucian, it can be very interesting because it really does make him think, you know, twice about trying to go in and trade for damage. So overall, really like what Dignitas was able to do in the draft here, and obviously they played it out incredibly well. Player of the series, pretty easy choice for me here, is going to go to Insanity in the mid lane. He got my dud of the series in series number 1 for Dignitas. He's going to get player of the series here, that Yone game in particular in game number 2. Very, very fun to watch, but he was really good on the Kassadin as well. Insanity, we all knew he was going to be one of the best mid laners in the NACL. Just probably a little bit of a speed bump to start the year. He should be getting back on track right around now. He has been so good at this level for so many years. I would not be surprised at all if he just continues to be one of the best mid laners that we have here. But it certainly wasn't just him that was interesting in this series. I actually do want to give a small shout out to Hoon. Hoon is somebody obviously who I've been very critical of on this channel, but he did a lot of good things here. He did die just a lot, but that's kind of Hoon's play style. He's going to go in, he's going to try to make plays. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. They were ahead in this game, and so Hoon was actually relatively fun to watch. I think he was making a lot of good plays. He was beating up on Surdy, and overall, this is one of the better Hoon performances that I've seen in quite a while overall for Dignitas. XU continues to look incredible. I still think he's probably going to be one of, if not the best jungler in the NACL. And Tomo and Diamond are just so incredibly solid in that bot lane. I love the ability to bring out something like the Brand in the bot lane. I think that's a really underrated tool to be able to use, and they really dominated, especially in that game too. I mean, that Lucian Sona lane we will get to in a minute completely crashed and burned. Pun kind of intended, pun intended towards the end of my sentence. Yeah, I don't know. Tomo and Diamond looking solid. You always like to see these weird drafts work out for a side like Dignitas. I think this really is more of the time of the year that they are going to be trying things because I think they know they have one of the most talented and proven rosters in the NACL right now. So now is the time to see what kind of drafts you can get away with, and this one absolutely worked out. But big credit to Insanity, and big credit to Hoon, honestly. Very, very fun to watch. For TLF, not the worst loss in the world. You're a team that really shouldn't be on the same level as a team like Dignitas. Dignitas obviously is one of the more talented teams in all of the NACL. You're looking to just kind of compete at a lower level. You don't want to be the worst team in the league. And I think they've proven throughout this first week they're probably not the worst team in the league. However, a little bit of a speed bump here. I think this bot lane especially got a little bit run over. Rovex on the Sona goes 0-8-0 in game number 2. Certainly not what you want to see. I think, you know, I've talked about this before on this channel and in this video, in fact. The Lucian Nami trade is almost never in favor of Lucian. I don't really understand why you would go for that. I think in most cases, if you can't get both, you should just let them have Nami and you should take something else, because the Lucian plus Sona or Lucian really plus anything, Lulu, whatever you want to end up, Yumi, whatever you end up wanting to go for there, it just doesn't have the same kind of power. It is shown to not really be able to break through something like the Nami, and I think that was the case again in game number 2. Mia and Rovex, I think, did struggle into Tomo and Diamond with, you know, having to play on that weak side early on against the Caitlyn Lux in game number 1, and then having to play against this ridiculous Brand Nami bot lane in game number 2. But it wasn't really like anybody else on TLF was really stepping up. Aspect has just kind of been meh to start the year. It's kind of what I expected. City Witty just kind of been okay to start the year. I actually had pretty decent expectations for him, but it hasn't really come to fruition yet. And Surdy, definitely a little bit of a regression, I would say, from the first split of the year, or the first set of the year that he was really, really solid in series, I guess is the word I'm looking for. So overall, looking at both of these teams, TLF definitely still has some room to improve. Rovex is going to get my dud of the series again. You can't really go 0-8-0 on Sona and not get dud of the series. So he's unfortunately going to get that. That bot lane definitely needs to get a little bit more consistent, but I have seen a lot of good things out of them over the course of the first 4 games that they've played. It just wasn't able to come together in this series, and so I still have faith that they're not going to be the worst bot lane in amateur or in Academy or NACL. Sorry, I said it wrong 3 different times, so that's really fun. But I still have faith they're not going to be the worst bot lane here by a considerable margin. I think there are definitely ones that have a lower upside, but right now they're just kind of not impressing me all that much, and I think that's kind of the overall mantra for TLF. They're just kind of, There's a reason I rank this team number 16 in my power rankings at the beginning of the split. I don't think that they are number 16. I think there are teams that have shown that they probably should be below them, but I don't think TLF is like that far ahead of a lot of these other teams. I think they are going to struggle to kind of compete with a lot of those top teams like Dignitas. But for Dignitas, you really have to feel comfortable that they are sort of starting to solidify themselves as a top team. Their first series of the year wasn't exactly the most convincing against TSM. You would have hoped to see them be a little bit more dominant in that series, but they trade 1-1, and honestly, TSM looks like the better team. Nice bounce back here. Insanity looked really good on these two more aggressive picks, and then you've got XU here playing really, really solid, Hoon playing well, the bot lane kind of winning. Everything just looked good for Dignitas in this series, and I think if you're a fan, you're really just hoping that they're able to continue that, and you're hoping that, just like last year, they're going to continue to be one of the best teams in this part of North America. Moving on to our fourth series here of day 3. We had one that I was actually really looking forward to, at least in terms of outlook for the rest of the season, because if one of these teams steps up and really is proving to be better, then it really does mean a lot for their outlook, I think, in general. And you know what? They kind of did here. A little bit rambly of an intro, but we have Golden Guardians Challengers taking on the Cincinnati Fear, and it's a 1-1 draw. Now, this isn't a particularly surprising 1-1 draw. I think a lot of people would look at these two teams as relatively around the same boat, but the Fear have been in really good form over the course of the first couple of games of this year, and honestly, I was kind of interested to see if they would be able to just be better than Golden Guardians, because if that was the case, I really do think that would say a lot about both teams. And while they weren't able to take both games, they did lose game number 1. I actually do think that, as a whole, they probably did look better in this series, which is expected, but also really, really good to see from them. So let's actually talk about them first, even though Golden Guardians won game number 1. Actually, no, we'll go in order. I like the order. Game number 1 was won by Golden Guardians, and big surprise, very similar to what I've been saying about this team for the last, 3 series that they have played. Off the back of Young, who just continues to look really good in the mid lane here. The Kassadin game number 1 was a Kassa win game. I mean, this was full investing into that Kassadin, making sure he is in a position to be able to win once he hits level 11. And he did. Obviously, a very good game by Fear up until that point in order to try and keep it close. But Kassadin was just too strong. The Lucian was able to get online in the mid game, and Young and Array were able to take over a lot of the game. Topside definitely still a weakness, which is a theme, obviously, for Golden Guardians. We'll get into that in game 2, but Young especially is just way too good for this Golden Guardians team, and I think he's proven that over the course of the first 3 series. Then you look at game number 2, and game number 2 was all Fear. I actually think this one was significantly more dominant. They really had a good game plan going into it. Golden Guardians doesn't have the Kassa win ideology, and so a lot of their other picks that maybe weren't as strong, things like the Cassante, things like the Vi, that didn't really work out in the first game, got a little bit more exploited in the second game. They weren't bailed out nearly as much, and it's really in testament to my player of the series here in this one, Shochi, that Fear was really able to rebound and have a really solid game number 2. Really, really good series from Shochi. I've actually been super impressed with him over the course of the beginning of the year. This entire top side, pretty much all of Fear, but most especially this entire top side, and the solo laners in particular of Faisal and Shochi, I think have been really the standout members of Fear over the first 3 series that they have run here, and Shochi looked phenomenal in this one. 2 games of Syndra. Game number 1 wasn't particularly bad. He just got outscaled by a Kassadin. It happens. Game number 2, though, I think you could really attribute a lot of Fear's success in the game to him. Not only was he able to generate a pretty big lead on Young, the best player on Golden Guardians, but he was able to steal a dragon on Syndra, which is always huge, and that damage in those team fights, people underestimate how much Syndra can do to a large group of people over the course of the fight. People always kind of associate Syndra with that big one single target burst ability, but I think she can become a lot more than that if she has time and peel from the rest of her team. Add that on top of an Aphelios and a Camille that is just diving right onto your Lucian. You don't really have a lot of options on the side of Golden Guardians to play from behind in this one. You needed to be able to generate that lead early, and it just wasn't working, and so Shochi is going to get my player of the series here. 2 really, really solid games of Syndra. Big credit to Faisal. Big credit to Perry. Again, those 3 have really been super dominant and super fun to watch on the side of Fear. I really hope that keeps up for the rest of the year because they've been a blast to watch on the top side. As for Golden Guardians, dud of the series again, no surprise, man. It's going to be Concept. He had 17 deaths across 2 games in professional play. That's not good. I don't know what else to tell you. I understand that he's playing a tank and that sometimes you're going to have to die a lot on the tank, right? But 17 is so excessive, and this has always been Concept's thing. He plays these off-meta tank bruisers. I thought K'Sante was going to fit exactly up that alley. I talked about that in my power rankings. I'm like, maybe this is the year of Concept, because he can just play K'Sante every game, and that feels like exactly his playstyle, but you know, you look back on the Mundos, you look back on the Zacs that he was playing last year, things like Malphite, you know, the signature Concept picks that you think of when you think of that player. And this is what he does, is he trades his life over and over and over again, and it really is costing Golden Guardians. He's going to get my dud of the series again, although realistically, I think you could give this to Rosethorn. Those two have been, quite frankly, just bad to start the year. There's no other way to say it. Young has been legitimately one of the best players in the NACL to start the year, and Concept and Rosethorn have both been two of the worst. They have absolutely no synergy together, and I think both of them are playing some of the worst league that I've seen them play. If they continue to do that, Golden Guardians is not going to be a team that can genuinely compete with some of the rest of the teams. They're a Challengers team. They're supposed to be top 10. I don't care what anybody says. If you are an LCS-backed Challengers team, you know, if you're Golden Guardians Challengers, you should be top 10. Anything less is a disappointment, and they do not look anywhere close to a top 10 team right now. Fear was better than them. They were able to pull out game number 1 because Young is just that good. And Array, I don't want to take away from him. He did play really well in that game number 1 as well, but the whole package of this team is just not coming together right now, and it's becoming a pretty big issue, I would say, for them overall. As for the Fear, you gotta love how this season has started. They actually look really, really good. They're going to end week number 1 at a 4-2 record, which is really, really solid for a provisional amateur team, especially one that I wasn't exactly as knowledgeable on as some of the other casters were. I know a lot of other NACL talent were really high on this team, whereas I was high on teams like Wildcard and AoE instead. I think it turns out all 3 of them are really good, and I think all 3 of them are going to push forward. But Fear are definitely, you know, a group of players and one of those teams that I think you're going to have to look out for against pretty much anybody for the rest of the year. They are not going to be an easy out against pretty much any team. Moving on to series number 5 now, we get a matchup between two teams that really have a lot to prove, quite frankly, between the two of them. Both of them starting off the year 0-4, and so a lot riding on this matchup for them. We have FlyFam taking on CLG Faith, and they split 1-1. There really isn't a lot of distinction or separation for either of these two teams, but man, both of them really needed to show something. For me, I do think there are some takeaways, but at the end of the day, I'm looking at both of these teams very similarly to how I looked at them before all of this as well. It hasn't really changed my thoughts and opinions on them all that much, but we can go ahead and go over it. Game number 1 was the FlyFam win, and a lot of it was off the back of their bot lane looking really good, although I do want to say, pretty much everybody on the team looked good in game 1. Goo and Blaze had really solid games on the Vi and the Ahri, respectively. The Ahri game from Blaze, really, really fun to watch. Probably my favorite game of the series from either team. It was a really, really good one. But Instinct and Sword on the Lucian Nami were also really, really solid. Really easy to play. Lucian Nami is. I don't mean to just like take away from their accomplishments, but why do teams just willingly give this over without trading something like the Zeri? I understand if you like this Varus Heimerdinger lane, but we'll get to Sketch and Plux. You just need something else. You need Caitlyn Lux. You need some way to push your advantage early. You need some way to not have to play from even, because I'm not exactly sure if the CLG Faith team is going to be all that good from even, but credit to Instinct and Blaze and Goo. They were really the 3 players in game number 1. Sword as well. Let's not take away from Sword. Those 4 were really the big standouts for FlyFam in game number 1. Game number 2 was a CLG Faith win. They've got to be super lucky and super happy that they have NXI on this roster. I think without NXI, this roster is looking very doomed. The solo lanes have not been good. Bot lane has not been good. But NXI, I think, is someone who can win you games. And I think he had a really good game number 2 here. But shout out to Bajani. I know I've been very critical of him over the course of their first 2 series, but he was really good in game 2. Him and NXI paired up to be kind of the big focal points for CLG Faith and their win in game number 2. The K'Sante was really difficult to take down. And Elise did a really good job of being able to generate that lead early so that they could just snowball out of control from there. But that's not to say everything was perfect for CLG Faith. My dud of the series is going to go to Sketch. In the bottom lane, you could give this to Plux. Sketch was worse in game number 1 when they lost. Plux was worse in game number 2 when they won. This is just not a good bot lane. Like, I really don't know what else to say. I think I had a lot of faith that Sketch and Plux would be good coming into the year. I actually really liked how they played last year in 2022 together, but it's not translated to this level. I mean, playing a team like FlyFam, you really need them to step up. Like, FlyFam's not some overwhelming force that is just like, oh, well, it's okay maybe that they weren't able to be on the same level. You know, they're playing like a challenger team or whatever. They're not. FlyFam has not been all that good. Their bot lane, while I do think it is by far the strongest part of their team, it's certainly not unbeatable. Sword has certainly shown weaknesses in the past, but man, Sketch and Plux just do not look like they're on the same level as any of the other bot lanes that they've played against so far in the NACL. Hopefully they're able to change that around, but Sketch is going to get my dead of the series here. Reasonably, I think you could give it to either. On the side of CLG Faith, big shout out to NXI. He was easily the best player for CLG Faith, not only for the whole week, but for this series in particular. He really is the only player on this team that I think has shown any signs so far this year of consistency. Hopefully he gets some lanes that he can actually play to throughout the year as it goes on, but right now, feels pretty doomed. And then Bajani, honestly, shout out. Best series of the year by a considerable margin. He was really bad over their first two series. He had a lot better of a series here against FlyFam. Hopefully that means he's moving in the right direction, although Lunacia is probably the weakest player that he has played against so far. For FlyFam, pretty much everybody looked good in game number one. It's really hard to take away a lot from game number one. Game number two is where it gets a little bit more interesting in terms of an analysis standpoint. I thought Goo and Blaze both took a relative step back in game number two on the Vi and Ahri. Certainly not nearly as strong when NXI does get that early lead on the Elise for the Vi to be able to counter that and move forward. But big credit to this bot lane. I still think this bot lane played really well in game number two. The Lucian Nami pick is incredibly strong, and Instinct and Sword should be the big focal points for FlyFam. They really are the dominant players. Instinct was playing in the LCS last year, for Christ's sake, so I expect them to be getting a lot of resources. Instinct is going to get my player of the series for FlyFam. He continues to look pretty okay, although I don't think that was necessarily always the case through their first few series. I don't necessarily think this bot lane looked bad throughout the year so far. When you're looking at upside for FlyFam, I think Goo and Blaze do look like a very interesting jungle mid duo, at least for the long term. I'm not exactly sure if that's going to come to fruition this year, but I like both of them as prospects. I just don't know if it's going to be 2023 for them. And then Instinct and Sword are probably going to be the ones carrying the load, but overall, for both of these teams, I don't think I saw enough to really change my opinion about them all that much. These still probably look like two of the worst teams in the league for me, but it's probably a relief off of both of their shoulders that they were able to pick up their first wins of the year respectively. Going into week two, you can start to build some confidence, and ideally, you can start getting that synergy together so that you can maybe surprise some people from where you started this year. That's going to bring us to our final series here of week one in the NACL. This video is ridiculously long, the longest that I have to make in a week, but you know what? I love doing it because I love the NACL, and we get to close it off with a battle of two challenger teams in TSM Challengers and FlyQuest Challengers, and FlyQuest really does kind of wipe the floor with TSM. They looked pretty good in their first series of the year, TSM that is, not so much in the second. Hanser was really the only one who came to show up in this series. Everything else was FlyQuest, FlyQuest, FlyQuest. Let's talk about them first. They won both game one and game two. Game number one, super bloody, but mostly on the side of FlyQuest. Obviously, Masu wins that 2v2 in the bottom lane pretty early on, and then from there on, just carries the game. It's out of control. Varus, when he does get ahead, can be pretty problematic to actually have to deal with, and man, let me just say, it's going to be a little bit of a theme, but Wild Turtle played so bad in this series. I mean, it was horrendously not good, but Masu, I think, really looked good in game number one, and he looked good in game number two. I don't want to take that away from him, and with how good the top three played, and we talked about this going into the preseason, the top three should be some of their best players in their roles, respectively, Philip, Yuji, and Spirax, and Masu playing this well with a substitute support. I don't think I mentioned that really at all in the video so far, but Kisong is not their starting support. Obviously, Winsome is going to be their FlyQuest Challenger support, but he's playing in LCS right now because Ayla couldn't come over from OS, and so a little bit of a roster shakeup, but Masu is a really, really solid player, and I think he really showed that here. This was something that I really wasn't expecting. He was by far the least experienced and least knowledgeable member of FlyQuest Challengers for me going into the season. I went so far as to say that I was really surprised to see Masu on FlyQuest Challengers over Instinct, who was on FlyFam. I just assumed that swapping those two made more sense for both of those teams, but clearly Masu set out on a mission to prove me wrong in this one, as he's going to get my player of the series. A fantastic one. He outdueled two, LCS quote-unquote caliber players. Obviously Wild Turtle and Chime, both LCS caliber players at some point in their career. Wild Turtle maybe not there right now, as we'll talk about in just a bit, but still a very impressive showing to play against an active LCS support that I think is good, and an AD carry that is probably one of the greatest that this region has ever seen, and just look really dominant in this series. You gotta love that. Like I said, Yuji, Spirax looking really good. They kind of found their synergy. They were really struggling for that, I think, in their first series of the year, but I felt like it was only a matter of time before they got back on the same page. They way outplayed Svenskeren and Doxa, so that's super impressive. We'll talk about Svenskeren in a bit, and Doxa, honestly. Both of them played very poor in this series, just getting completely outplayed by Yuji and Spirax. And Philip was also incredibly impactful. I mean, it is really difficult to deal with Jax and Gangplank when you're your team is behind, and Philip did a really good job of taking advantage of that, even if I don't think Hanser played particularly bad. And so overall, really solid series from FlyC. On the side of TSM, yikes, like, this is not good. This is a team full of veterans. You need them to win. Like, they cannot be losing. I had them ranked number 9 in my power rankings. I'm not entirely surprised that they weren't able to pick up a win against a team like FlyQuest, who I do think is better than them, but that's still a really bad sign for how this season is going to go. Hanser, like I said, looked pretty good, but Svenskeren, Doxa, Wild Turtle, they did not look good, and they're going to have to, because they don't really give you the kind of upside where you can say, like, oh, they're not playing well now, well, maybe, maybe in like 4 weeks, they'll, learn some more champions, or they'll get more used to being on stage. They should be used to this by now. I understand that nobody's really, everybody's playing from home. It's NACL, and so maybe there are some outstanding factors, right? Maybe somebody's playing on 100 ping. I think Masu was actually playing on 100 ping in this game, but I'm not going to pretend like I know everything that's going on. What I'm saying is, it's never going to be a good sign when you have a bunch of proven LCS players that aren't able to actually compete at an NACL level. That, typically speaking, it is easy to say they don't have the upside to get to where a player like Philip, UG, or Spirax might be able to get to if they continue to grow. It really does feel like players like Svenskeren and Wild Turtle are just kind of on the downturn. Wild Turtle, an easy choice for dud of the series here. He was abysmal in game number 1. He just played bad on the Kalista, was constantly under-ranged here, which is always going to be a little bit of a problem with Kalista, but golly, it just got punished a lot. How much are you really going to do into a champion like Jax? And then Zeri in game number 2, you simply have to be your team's win condition. You have a Syndra, you've got a Vi, you've got a lot of ways to set up late game team fights, and you just lost super hard early to this Lucian Nami combo. Again, Lucian Nami's incredibly strong, but you can't be losing this hard early on and expect to win. So Wild Turtle becoming a problem. You would expect to see a little bit more from Chime, but honestly, I don't think he played all that bad. I think Wild Turtle kind of ran it a lot of the series, and Chime was just kind of along for the ride. Svenskeren and Doxa look very weak as a jungle mid duo. I kind of expected that. Sven was someone who I thought was going to come in and be really good at this level, if only because he was making a lot of money as a streamer, and I think that, for him to leave streaming, I figured he would have to feel really confident that he was going to be an addition, a plus player at this level, and I just don't know if I see that in this game. Doxa, I had a lot of, question marks about coming in. I had him as the lowest ranked mid laner, wasn't super in love with his tape. I think that's kind of come to fruition so far. Again, really the only player that I think has some upside here on TSM, or at least so far has shown that upside on the Rift, has been Hanser, who I actually think has been pretty good up on the top side. But overall, what does this mean for both teams? TSM needs to be better. This is a team that can't really afford to be 1-3 at the end of week 1, right? Like, this is a team that needs to be competing for top 6, or else it's really just not all that worth it for them. And so right now, you need to see them be able to get their shit together. Hopefully, Wild Turtle and Svenskeren can kind of get together. Hopefully, once Dragku comes in, him and Doxa can offer some sort of upside for TSM. But right now, I'm just not super thrilled about what I saw in this series. For FlyQuest, this is exactly the kind of series you wanted to see for them to get back on track. The top 3 played exactly as I wanted them to, and Masu looked like a superstar at that AD carry position, even with some factors that may have been out of his control. And so overall, great series for FlyQuest, not so great series for TSM. All right, that is going to do it for my NACL Week 1 overview and analysis. Up on the screen, you're going to see the updated NACL standings after Week 1. Of course, any ties will just be broken alphabetically. In the first column, to the right of the team, you're going to see my updated power rankings for the team. In the second column, you're going to see how those have changed from last week, the preseason, to this week. Let's go over the biggest risers and the biggest fallers. The biggest riser this week is going to be the Cincinnati Fear, who jump up all the way from number 15 to number 9. I mean, that is about as good as it gets, I would say, overall for a lot of these teams. Jumping up 6 spots is incredibly impressive. They looked very good. I mean, they are right in the mix of a lot of these, provisional amateur teams. You'll see I have Wildcard as another big leaper, jumping up from 11 to 8, and then obviously AoE jumping up from 12 to 10 as well. A lot of these provisional amateur teams that had talent that I just wanted to see performed at that level, and a lot of the challenger teams that I was kind of waiting to see if they would fall out, fell out, and so a couple adjustments made there. But Fear's my biggest riser of the week. Of course, also worth noting, Cloud9 going from number 4 in my power rankings to number 1, and we'll get to why in just a bit. You can already see his face on the screen. But biggest fallers this week, again, not a lot of surprises. The biggest faller is going to be Immortals Challengers, going from number 8 in my power rankings to number 12. That top side looks like a problem, and they don't really seem to have a lot of ways to fix that. Blaze Olive's going to be leaving the team soon, and I honestly think that's just going to make them worse, because he was kind of the biggest win condition in their second series of the week. Outside of that, other big followers, Golden Guardians Challengers dropping down to 13. They are the lowest ranked Challengers team. They are ranked at 13. They have a lot of provisional amateur teams ahead of them. That's not good. And then pretty much everybody else down at the bottom of the standings. FlyFam, CLG, TSM, all dropping about 2 spots. And so that's going to be it for my power rankings, but that means we get to jump into my player of the week and my dud of the week. Of course, no flame to these players. You can have a bad week. It's totally normal to have one bad week. They can always bounce back and they can always be better. But my player of the week in week 1 in the NACL is going to go to Eminus on Cloud 9. I mean, an unbelievable start to the year. He's a big reason why I believe in this team at number 1 now, because he has shown basically everything that you want to see out of the best player in the NACL, and that's kind of what he was over the first week. I think it was a pretty easy call. The other players that I considered, of course, Moose Hater on Wildcard had to be in the conversation, and Sniper on 100 Academy, or 100 Challengers, I should say, definitely deserve to be in that conversation as well. My dud of the week, unfortunately, is going to go to Concept on Golden Guardians Challengers. Not a good week for Concept. He has continued what has been a little bit of a downward spiral over the past year or so, has not really ever adapted to this level all that well, continues to play aggressive, and continues to be a little bit of a hindrance for his team. Hopefully, he can get it, if he can just be a little bit less, prone to dying. I actually think that this team really isn't that bad of a spot, but it really is not good on the top side right now. His teammate Rosethorn certainly in that conversation as well, and I would be remiss not to mention Bajani as another candidate for dud of the week. However, he did redeem himself a bit towards that final series, and so that's going to do it for week 1. Let me know what you guys thought down in the comment section below. If you enjoyed the video, hit that like button. Obviously, if you stayed for an hour and 50 minutes of me talking about the NACL, you probably enjoyed the video, so hit that like button. Of course, if you're new, hit subscribe. I post videos like this every single week, not only on the NACL, but on all 4 of the top major regions as well. But, of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.